right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. Commissioner Jones will be joining us a little bit later. He had a commitment right now, so I expect him to join us as soon as he's available. I'm going to go ahead and just turn this over to our city manager. He's one that has worked on organizing today, and I know his team has been working hard to bring all of the pieces together to have a very fruitful workshop.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, Commissioners.
Good afternoon.
And this side of the room, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I appreciate your taking time in the spirit of this Thanksgiving season. I'm very thankful for all the work that has been done since the past year. I'm very thankful for an opportunity to reflect on that, but also to prioritize our work for fiscal year 21. I'm absolutely thankful for the tremendous amount of work that the staff has put into this effort to make this day possible. So my appreciation to all the staff for their hard work, those that are around the room here, and many of them obviously that could not be part of this conversation today, but are ensuring that great city services are performed. I certainly want to thank our Performance and Management and Sustainability Officer, Ms. Allison Sutter, for her leadership in helping us to ensure accurate planning and reporting, as well as the many other members of my cabinet staff, as well as the Fiscal Services Department. And you will hear from our interim CFO, Ms. Molly Claren, and our deputy CFO this afternoon as well. So as we began, we wanted to make sure that we continue to be values, vision, and mission focused as an organization, and ensure that we align our strategic direction thanks to your leadership around our values and our 6 priorities that further ensures that we become the kind of living, welcoming, and equitable, innovative, and collaborative city that allows us to have a safe community and a healthy economy with a high opportunity for quality of life for all of our residents. And so today what we'll do, we'll be intentional about that in our future in making sure that first of all, we reflect on the work that is being done and have an opportunity to determine of that work, what work needs to continue or perhaps pivot somewhat. We'll also talk about the financial health of our organization, and I think you will hear a good report card, preliminary report card on our fiscal year 19 performance, and also an update on the FY20 forecast, and that will allow us to begin to discuss the prioritization or the horizon issues for FY21. There is a lot of conversation that we need to have today, and we're looking for your feedback. And again, your feedback around the horizon topics will be good input as we consider the priorities for fiscal year 21 fiscal plan. But I do want to talk a little bit about just the logistics for the day. We do want your feedback. This is outside of the financial performance update. This is not going to be a budgety conversation. So the first part, we do have to get an update, but beyond that, those prioritization discussions, horizon topics are very broad policy issues. We're not asking you to vote. We're not asking you to place dots. We're not asking you to make any decisions. We just want your feedback today, and we'll try to see if there's enough that gives us a good sense of just some of the thoughts around the commission. This will not be the last time we have this conversation, and I'll go around the schedule, but just for a purpose of managing the conversation today so that we can get through all of the material and try to get you out as early as possible. There are opportunities for natural breaks today. And I will give you those slide numbers. Slide 37, slide 44, slide 49, slide 54, slide 61 and slide 67 are those where we will pause very deliberately and ask for your feedback. The first 37 or so, because of the financials, I think we'll have our financial staff come if you could. I know it's a lot, but it will probably, we could park all day on any one slide, but if you allow them to get through the material, then we can go back and answer any questions that you might have on the financial reports. And then your homework, if you will be to take a look at the feedback that the staff, many of them who are here, we had on occasion we've had management. Top management retreats, and we talk about strategy, talk about the performance of the organization, and we have gotten feedback on metrics. We have over 150 metrics, and we are attempting to develop a dashboard report card for the organization at any given time where we can identify our top 20 to 40 metrics in a very automated open way to look at the health of the organization. And we'll at the end of the day, we'll tell you what the staff work has been in terms of highlighting some of those metrics and how we would like to get your feedback as we build this dashboard and report card. On the next slide, you have the performance management and budget schedule. Today, we're here to kind of kick things off in terms of looking at both the present and the future. We intend to come back in February to do a formal mid-year report on the performance of the organization, and also to have additional reflection on some of the prioritization. And that will allow us to take that input and to finalize where we're headed in terms of our fiscal plan, which will be presented on April 28th. You should have received invites to hold those dates on the calendar, as well as you'll see subsequent budget review workshops on the 5th and the 12th, and a committee of the whole discussion on the 19th, which will have a public hearing on the 19th as well, and hopefully deliberate and adopt a budget on the 21st. The asterisks on the timeline are those that will indicate special called meetings, and so we'll have to make sure we get those properly approved by the governing body. So I will pause here before we go into the financial forecast to see if you have any questions about the day or any of the slides that I've shared so far. Nope. Okay. Well, with that, we will ask our financial management team to come and take us through the slides. Oh, there you go.
And I need you to speak into a microphone. Yes.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here today and present you with this financial update. The focus of this update will be the fiscal 19 actual results, but we'll also get a little bit into fiscal 20 year-to-date numbers as well. The intention of this update is to give you a good understanding of the financial condition of the city, as well as the city's capacity as we move into this next budget planning season. So with that, let's jump right into the general fund, which will be the primary focus of this presentation. We'll get into other areas as well, but we will focus on general fund. As you can see from this slide in the yellow highlighted column, our revenues over expenditures ended fiscal 19 at $7.2 million. That's a budget, that's a variance to the estimate of approximately $5.6 million. As you can see in the right-hand column, the majority of this variance was on the revenue side, principally tax revenue and also investment results driving the revenue side. The revised fiscal 20 fund balance percentage puts us at 27.6%. The next slide, what I put together is the general fund statement that you see in the fiscal plan. However, I updated it to drop in the fiscal 19 actual results as well as carry forward amounts of approximately $284,000. As you can see, that brings us to fund balance of $40.8 million, which is an increase from our estimate of $35 million. This is a summary of our targets for both the general fund and the budget stabilization fund. In the general fund, as a reminder, we have a target of 15%. As you can see, we ended fiscal 19 at 26.8%. Our budget stabilization fund, we aim for a target of 10% of general operating fund expenditures, and we're holding exactly at that 10% mark, so we're right on target with that. Just to give you some background on my next slide, all things being the same, when we're in a period of increasing appropriations, that budget stabilization percentage will tend to drift downwards as appropriations rise if we don't continue to put transfers into the budget stabilization fund. So what I put together on this slide is to just give you a sense of if we were to increase our target to either 11% or 12%, we could do a transfer this fiscal year of $2 million to get to 11%, or $3.5 million would take us to 12%. Again, that's based on revised fiscal 20 projections. The next slide gives us the history. I think it's about a 10-year history of our fund balance reserve in both the general fund and the budget stabilization fund. As you can see on the general fund, we hit our low point in fiscal 12, and we've had a nice steady upward trend, arriving at our 26.8% in fiscal 19. The budget stabilization line, which is the red line, we contributed our first amount in fiscal 13 to the budget stabilization fund and steadily increased that up through fiscal 16. Really, we've been holding fairly steady right around the 10% mark since fiscal 16. The next slide presents the same information, except instead of percentages, it's the dollar amount. This is where we're going to unpack a little bit the income tax coming in over estimate that I discussed slightly earlier. You can see our income taxes exceeded our estimate by $1.7 million. On the property tax side, we came in about $434,000 above estimate, so total about $2.1 million of favorable variance on the tax side. We had projected a 4.5% increase in fiscal 19, and it actually came in approximately 6.6%. Just as a reminder, income tax does continue to remain the largest revenue item on our general fund statement. In fiscal 20, we're projecting a 4% increase, and at this point in time, we remain relatively comfortable that that's going to be a good estimate. This slide looks at some additional revenue variances. We have charges for services, for miscellaneous service fees, code enforcement fees, and electric power distribution. All came in about where we were expecting in terms of the estimate. I don't want to alarm anyone with the A87 bar that's on there. We did receive information from our auditors. They requested us to reclass A87 out of other financing sources and into charges for services, so that's why you see the large spike here. You'll see the same level of drop on the next slide, so that's merely an audit adjustment. And finally, in the other category, that did come in about $1 million over estimate. I believe that was planning commission fees as well as special event labor fees that was driving that increase. Here's the next slide that I alluded to. On the right-hand side, you can see the drop in other financing sources. If I were to go ahead and add in the A87 charges, that would only be a variance of approximately $90,000. Intergovernmental to the left came in about as expected. That's where you're going to see the constitutional revenue sharing, some liquor license revenue, and then the state also contributes money for fire protection of its state-owned buildings. Again, continuing with some additional revenue variances, we have licenses and permits coming in slightly less than we had anticipated. That is for mostly cable consent fees as well as clerk license fees, and CD department also has some development and land use fees. The fines and forfeitures, our residents would probably be happy to see that coming in a little bit under estimate. That's primarily parking violations. And then the second driver of the revenue positive variance is the investment income. You can see that came in substantially higher than our estimate. And the two pieces of that is an adjustment that we do as of June 30th to bring our investments to market value. So that was approximately $835,000 of that variance. And then the second piece, the interest revenue income did just come in about $325,000 above expectations. So very good results with that. Turning to the expenditure side, I put this slide together just to kind of show how the various departments in the general fund came out in relation to the amended budget. We did have a few departments that were just very slightly over budget, $5,000 or less. The police department kind of sticks out there at $325,000, but we were anticipating at budget review time that could have actually been significantly more than that. So I'm very appreciative to the police department. They really did make some significant adjustments and got that back down for us. On the favorable side, the executive office, that large under amount is the result primarily of the community and police relations set aside that had been parked in the executive office prior to this current fiscal year. So the executive office started with $1 million in FY19. We had carried forward another $870,000 of unspent funds from the prior year, so we were about at $1.8 million, and I believe only about $350,000 was actually spent. This will no longer be an issue with the staffing investments and other investments that we made in fiscal 20 that has now effectively been moved to the police department. And then our general administration department is where we have various contractual amounts as well as subsidy transfers such as the parks mow, the district court, those type of expenditures. The reason that came in so far under is we have the contingent set aside in that department. That usually is about $1.5 million, and $1 million of it in fiscal 19 was not utilized. And the other $425,000 was for grant match set-asides that went underutilized for both police and the district court. The next slide shows our appropriation lapse history. You'll see for fiscal 19 we had lapse of approximately $5.3 million. We planned for $4 million, so that was $1.3 million more than we anticipated. However, on a percentage basis, the 3.7% lines up almost identically with the 5-year history on that. Turning our attention to vital streets, again, we have our goal of 70% good and fair by July of 2029. Fiscal 19 was the 4th year where we were collecting income tax from the 15-year temporary tax increase. That amounted to just over $14 million, up from about $13 million in FY18. And again, we ended fiscal 19, or the 2018 construction season, at 50% good and fair, and I believe that's up from about 37% prior to vital streets. Again, continuing with vital streets, we had a spend of approximately $21.4 million in fiscal 19. That's down from about $35 million in 18. The primary driver in 18 is we did have a $17 million principal payment that was due. In terms of state supplemental funding, the state did pass 2015 legislation that provided additional funding for roads and bridges. In 19, we did enjoy nearly $3.5 million in supplemental funding. And as everyone's probably heard, the legislature did pass $400 million in road and specific bridge funding in 20. A large portion of that was vetoed, and the remainder was moved into transit programs. So we will continue to monitor that situation. This next slide just kind of gives a summary at the top of the debt issues that we took out to advance fund the road work. Next year, August of 2020, we will have our last balloon payment, and the 2016 issue returns to much more level debt service of approximately $1.5 to $1.9 million annually. And at the bottom of that is some statistics that Rick DeVries was kind enough to provide for the fiscal 20 season. The 2013 Parks millage, we collected revenue of $4.2 million in receipts from this millage. The Parks Operating Fund also enjoyed a maintenance of effort subsidy from the general fund of approximately $6.2 million. Actual park investments total $3.3 million in FY19, with an additional $4.7 million planned in FY20. In the final fiscal 20 plan, we did model a significant decline in funding in FY22 as the 7-year Parks millage ended. But as you're all well aware, the new Parks millage did pass with an overwhelming majority on November 5th. And so that's anticipated to provide $5 million in funding beginning in FY22. We are currently partnering with the Parks Department to develop new investment guidelines. I believe those will be presented next month, and we do expect the maintenance of effort amount to continue to mirror the trend in general fund expenditures, so it will rise and fall depending on appropriations in the general fund. Talk about fiscal 20 year-to-date a little bit. State shared revenue, we budgeted approximately $18.8 million in fiscal 20. Well, we did receive a revised estimate just last month. Indicates we're going to receive approximately another $476,000 in shared revenue. Property taxes, kind of slow and steady is the story with property taxes. We're kind of seeing annual increases of 1% or less, so those continue to meet forecasts. In the area of personnel, we have continued efforts to recruit and retain talent, including ensuring that compensation remains competitive with the market. We continue to focus on succession planning. That said, certain positions do remain difficult to fill, so we are continuing to implement the trade skill stipend. The bargaining contracts have all been completed, and we have improvements in parental leave, health insurance, and sick leave improvements. In the area of capital management, we continue to implement sustainable asset management throughout the organization. Our capital set aside is currently 4.25% of non-vital streets income tax. That is down from the high we're at was 5% in fiscal 17. I do anticipate there to be continued pressure for additional capital funding this upcoming budget season, and so that'll always be kind of a delicate balancing act, determining the proper level between the general fund and the capital reserve fund. Fiscal 20 year-to-date income tax, the trend is exceeding projections at around 6% currently. We had forecast, again, 4% for income tax. Withholding is up approximately 2.4%, and the Income Tax Department continues to focus on various compliance activities. Some larger economic data. The national GDP is projected to increase 2.6% in 2019 and then tapers off in the following years a little bit. The Grand Rapids, Wyoming change in real GDP was 3.3% when that was last updated in 2017. Low unemployment rates are projected nationally, 3.7% in 20 and rising to 3.9 in 2021. The Grand Rapids, Wyoming unemployment rate as of August 2019 is 2.9%. I do have some information on net new housing units. So far year to date, we're at 264. Inflation remains in check. Overall, it fell to 1.7% in September. Slowing growth due to rising trade barriers and heightened geopolitical tension continues to cause concerns. And I've heard some economists predicting a weaker economy and risk of recession as early as the next 12 to 18 months. We did have one of our investment advisors in for a meeting last week, and they laid out a number of leading economic indicators from unemployment claims to consumer spending, trucking numbers, and they did not see any immediate alarms. So I guess cautious optimism at this point. I know the recession alarms have somewhat quieted from about 2-3 months ago. Property taxes, again, we're seeing slow growth, a little bit less than 1% per year. The chart at the top lays out our trend in state shared revenues. We bottomed out basically in fiscal 12, and we've been slowly climbing out of that since then. Projected growth is 1.7% for constitutional and 2.3% for statutory revenue sharing. And again, 50% of the CVTRS revenues are deposited into the general fund. The other half goes into the capital reserve fund. Touching on retiree health care, costs have become much more predictable since switching to the defined contribution type plans. The city did see significantly lower contribution rates in fiscal 20 budget among all three defined benefit retiree health care plans. This is primarily due to the elimination of anticipating future liability for the Cadillac tax. Just as a quick refresher, that is a 40% excise tax on health plans who exceed certain threshold amounts. The tax was originally supposed to be implemented in 2018. It's currently scheduled to be enacted in 2022. There has been support recently for eliminating this Cadillac tax, so we would obviously be supportive of that as well. The recent plan administrator changes that take effect January 1st should further reduce contributions for the retiree health care defined benefit plans. The top of this slide gives a summary financial information for all four of the retiree health care plans. Net position as of fiscal 19 did end up slightly better than the year before for all the plans. We currently have approximately 66% of employees enrolled in retiree health care savings accounts. And this is some really good news. The unfunded actuarial accrued liability has decreased substantially. It was as high as $216 million as recently as fiscal 2009. We cut that down to $104 million in fiscal 17, and as of the end of fiscal 19, we were down to $66 million. The current amortization periods in general and police fund is 19 years, and fire is 21. GASB allows a maximum of 30-year amortization on the unfunded liability. And the fiscal 19 actuarial valuations will be received later next month. Turning to pensions, our pensions are approximately 80% funded. The fiscal 18 general pension earnings exceeded the 7.15 assumed rate of return. And in fiscal 19, we did make additional contributions of $3 million to the general pension fund. That was the result of the fact that for budgetary purposes, we do use a blended rate between the defined benefit and the defined contribution plans. And that is provided by our actuary, and it was known when we did this that there would be a variance between the amounts collected through the payroll process and what was ultimately contributed to the defined benefit trust and the defined contribution plan. So over recent years, funds have been accumulating, and the decision was made to make that contribution against the liability. You also may recall that last budget season we did have some issues with the estimated rates coming in much higher than we had anticipated due to poor fourth quarter performance in 2018. To counter that, we have instituted an 18-month delay now between the estimate that's used for the upcoming budget season and the results from the prior valuation date. So we will not encounter that again this budget season, as we'll be using December 2018 projections. Turning to healthcare, we do have new 3-year contracts, and it's estimated that the city will save approximately $13 million over the term of those contracts. Providers will implement the changes as negotiated in the labor agreements. Some other considerations, the Affordable Care Act status does remain uncertain. Increases are forecast to exceed the rate of inflation. However, smoothing does continue to bring those rates down. Tiered rates were implemented in calendar 2019 for single, double, and family selections. The 2020 rate decrease is due to not only recognizing the potential impact of the third-party plan administrator changes, but also accounting for prescription rebates that were not previously included. And you can see what the impact would have been in the past 3 years had those rebates been incorporated. After calendar 2020, rates do increase above inflation due to medical and prescription industry trends. There is a $3 million surplus reduction forecast in 23 through 25 in the city's health care fund. This surplus reduction may be implemented sooner depending on the experience with the new administrators. One thing to keep in mind is the health care fund does require a considerable cash balance for 2 reasons. 1, to pay current claims, and 2, to provide stop-loss coverage for catastrophic claims, as the city is self-insured. So kind of looking forward on the positives, we obviously have incredibly strong general fund reserves. We do continue to see positive growth in income tax. Ongoing revenues are exceeding ongoing expenditures, and the city saw significantly lower contribution rates in fiscal 20 among all three defined benefit retiree health care plans. Additional state investments were approved to meet the 70% goal in vital streets. And the country is currently experiencing the longest economic expansion period in history. I believe we're at about 124 months at this point. Our local economy continues to outperform the rest of the state, and low unemployment rates are driving up wages while inflation remains in check. However, I would be remiss if I did not predict a little bit or share a little bit of downside as well. Our capital set aside may be insufficient to maintain all city asset classes, and again, that's something we'll have to evaluate this budget season, whether the 4.25 will be sufficient. Pension and OPEB costs do comprise a large portion of the budget, and you can see the amounts in the general fund is $21.3 million. Forecasts show ongoing expenses exceeding ongoing revenues as early as fiscal 21. And in fiscal 22 through 25, using current projections, we are projecting net losses ranging from about 2.5 to 3.8 million in those out years. Reserves can be utilized in the short term. However, long-term structural deficits are going to have to still be solved. And again, some economists predicting recession in the next year and a half or so. Taking a look at the capital reserve fund, we did have some one-time revenue from the transformation fund of approximately $572,000 in fiscal 19. As a matter of policy, we do like to maintain a minimum fund balance of $1 million. And the red numbers at the bottom of this shows where we're at in terms of that $1 million compared to ending fund balance. We do look good in fiscal 19. 20, we're still holding positive, but then in 21, we do start to see a little bit of a downturn in meeting that minimum fund balance. Ongoing revenues versus ongoing expenses. Targets will once again be used to assist with balancing the budget this upcoming season. We do have strategies to enhance current revenue streams, including income tax department compliance activities. Universal withholding continues to languish in the state legislature. You can see that's been out there since 2016. We do look for additional transformation savings, including shared services and budget reductions from process efficiencies. And we also have health and wellness program expansion. And again, this is just the upcoming budget schedule that was shared a little bit earlier, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Sandin, for that update. What I will do, Mayor, if it's okay with you, I will defer to you to facilitate the questions among your colleagues that they may have for staff, if that's okay.
That's great. Happy to do that. And I'll start us off with just a couple questions. So going back to pension liability. So if I'm reading this right, we are with being 81 and roughly 81% funded, taking, I'm sorry, slide number 29, taking both general retirement and police and fire, it's about $200 million we're underfunded right now.
That would be correct, yes.
So will you remind me how long it will take us to get, I'm sure we have projections out. When do we anticipate we will be fully funded again?
Currently,
I mean, just based on current projections, how much we're putting in, how the market is performing, do you have any sense? Are we looking at a 20-year, 30-year?
I know in the retiree healthcare funds, we're at about the 20-year mark, but I can certainly pull up the pension information and provide that.
Okay. And then I know when we contributed some additional funds in the past, what kind of impact does that have? Does that save us a year out? Do we have a good sense of that?
It does move the needle a little bit. I'm not going to say it makes a significant impact, but it does take a year or two off it, absolutely.
Mayor, if I could, in terms of funding ratio, obviously 100% is ideal, but the ratio that we're at now is 80% or above is a respectable funding ratio among the industry, and I would suspect that we're better funded than many other pension plans throughout the country. So while we would want to have maximum funding, I think we do have a healthy pension.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the police and fire continues to be okay because we continue to add, there's people paying into that system. The general fund actually, I think, gets worse before it gets better based on, life cycles and
Closing and starting it.
right, amortization, so.
And then one other question I have, and then I'll see if my colleagues have any questions. I'll start over here with Commissioner Kelly. On the last slide there, or second to the last 35, you mentioned the state equity or court reform. Do you have any, I know Deputy City Manager was on that task force at the state level. Do we have any update on if any of the recommendations in that final report are actually going to move forward? I know there were a number of recommendations made from that. We're not the only court that has a significant deficit.
So thank you for that question. The answer is that there is activity. Ms. Farrick and I were in Lansing earlier this month, meeting with members of several committees to work to move this forward. There have been bill requests for 2 of the 5 recommendations, and there is interest. Now, we also heard that there are other issues that are in front of this, like the state budget. So, and once those are resolved, I think there's interest in moving forward to see what can be done. So the members of the task force are still active in working through this legislation. They appreciate our help, and I think there's a coalition that could be formed based on that.
Great, thanks. Thanks for your work on that. All right, I'll start over here with Commissioner Kelly.
First a comment and a couple of questions. Because you brought up pensions, I just wanted to suggest that, and I understand one of my second ward appointees is a chartered financial analyst, and I had some conversations with him when he was first appointed to learn about the difference in these various analyst positions, whether it's a chartered financial analyst or a CPA, and because this particular training is for people who manage such large funds, millions and billions, whether it's wealthy families or large pension funds, I would just encourage us to make sure when that person's appointment expires that we always try to find someone in that pool. Yes. Because a very slight change, a percent, can have such a dramatic effect.
Large impact.
We want to ensure that our employees are well protected over time. So just something to think about. I know Commissioner Moody serves on the board. I understand things are going well. Obviously, things are going very well. It's no problem. It's just, let's keep it that way. So I wanted to mention that. And then a question on page 5 about the bond. Does this, in terms of the budget stabilization fund, can you talk a little bit about how our contribution, one versus the other, 11% versus 12%, for example? I know our goal is 10%, and Commissioner O'Connor's talked about raising that amount. How that might affect our bond ratings, and then how those bond rating differences could perhaps save us money. I know Jan is here too, so is there an impact then by choosing one versus the other?
Absolutely. One of the criteria that the bond rating agencies do focus in on is our financial reserves. So the stronger those are, the more favorable bond rating we'll receive, and that does translate then into interest savings.
Okay, so it could be a wash or even better? Okay, that's
Correct.
That's a good thing to know. And then I had one other one. Let's see, where is this? Thought I folded the page. Here it is. On slide 17, can you talk a little bit more about the capital set aside may be insufficient? What are we looking at certain departments, certain assets?
Sure, I can give you a little better idea on that. I have been having some conversations with our energy, lighting, and communications department. I know they are interested in increased investment. I've heard the fire department is going to be looking years out for increased capital investment as well. So really a number of departments probably going to be looking for increased funding from the Capital Reserve Fund. And so that's where we're going to have to kind of do the balancing between the needs of the general fund and the capital needs that we're encountering as we go into the next budget season.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Commissioners, as you referenced the slides, there are two things. There are page numbers on the handout, and then there are slide numbers on the page, just to make sure we all stay on this.
Okay,
Let us know if you're either referring to the page number or the actual slide number.
Okay. Commissioner O'Connor?
Thank you. We'll talk about slides like 8 through 12, 8 through 13, something like that. Obviously good financial news. It's great that, we beat our projections, and, just always have to point out the, income tax is, that's our bread and butter.
Absolutely.
Mosley and Headley, we're kind of, without changes to those, property tax is never going to be our winner.
Income tax
As we
by
make
far.
decisions and think about things, remember, just not to shoot the golden goose, guys, that income tax pays the bills and gives us flexible dollars.
You're just making a statement or?
Just making a statement, but I do have some questions. That statement's important, though. Because, again, those dollars are what let us do things
Yeah.
that prepare us for the future and invest in things that, we all hold near and dear. But I guess my question was, and we brought it up last year, and Commissioner Kelly alluded to it, was to both the Budget Stabilization Fund and the General Fund set aside of 10 and 15%, which is obviously great that we've exceeded those. I'm all for increasing those. I think last year we talked briefly about, the commission has sort of their own policy of 15% and 10% as goals. And rather than, I think it's important that we maybe reprioritize our goals and set new goals. And then rather than have a set aside based on what makes us feel good in a moment in time, that we sort of tie that set aside to something, that if we have $5 million, that do we allocate 50% of any income tax overage or increase in revenue, then do we set a percentage of that away towards those goals, rather than, make us have this internal debate about what our values are every year, and what do I want to invest in parks or pools or police or swimming pools or whatever, that if there's $5.8 million in overage and we have a goal of getting this to 11, 12, 13%, whatever that long-term goal is, do we just have a rational discussion about setting aside a portion of that every year in an effort to achieve those two goals? And
I appreciate that comment, and I'd like a little bit more information as well, how that's tied to potentially improving our bond rating, which we know has a positive impact across the board and could save us money.
Right.
It's been a goal of ours to increase our bond rating for a long time. If we think that is something concrete that we need to do to get there, I'd like more information about that.
I can certainly provide that.
But at least as a starting point, I would like and I would ask that we consider amending our city policy to have new goals. Again, they're only goals, but they're still, I think it's important that they're codified into something, so we know,
Yeah.
you don't know how to get there unless you know what you're trying to shoot for. The other point, I think, is the point of, where do we leverage the dollars to get the most bang for the buck, right? Like putting it in the pension fund, as much as that, we all have our concerns about the pension fund, that's probably not the smartest use of taxpayer dollars to leverage those dollars to have different outcomes. And so I do think that, I celebrate Grand Rapids often because of the Capital Reserve Fund and the fact that we do take care of our assets so that, they're sustainable into the long term. So potentially looking at amending that policy as well to say, do we want to have a 4.75 or 5% capital reserve set aside with using those income tax revenues that are in excess to make sure that that's appropriately funded, because, to Mr. Sandin's point of the economy's going to blow up here in 12 to 18 months, we should be ready for that.
Well, and in addition to that, and something your former colleague always talked about too, is having money set aside to make investments that have long-term positive impact on reducing operational costs. So making sure that we're, similar to what we did with the Transformation Fund, investing in things that will reduce our operational costs. And I do think that that's something that we need to, even though we don't have that fund still, we need to be thinking about what can we invest now that will reduce our costs in the future. Yeah. And then I'll go to Commissioner Lanier.
Can I thank you, Commissioner O'Connor, for that. And it's for that very reason we wanted to have the conversation, because not often are we able to have conversations about how do we spend excess and increase our reserve levels. But we want to do it in the context of if that is the most important, and we're going to talk about the horizon issues. And again, we're not asking people to vote, and that is on the topic, because it connects directly to what we think is one of our strategic goals of improving the bond ratings. But if that is our most important horizon issue under governmental excellence, and as we talk about the other areas, then that is right off the top. But we need to have that kind of discussion among the commission to see if it's that or if there are other one-time type of expenditures that might merit more conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Commissioner Linay?
Yeah, so my question is actually tied to that same discussion. I'm on slide 12, and I'm just more curious about, with the excess, are those funds restricted at all? Or do they go back to the general fund? Where do those funds land after we have the excess? Because I think it'll help, and maybe it'll be a part of the discussion, city manager, you're referring to, that'll happen later. And if it is, I'm fine with waiting until then, but just curious to know, what happens with those dollars and if there are funds that can be, spread in different directions or if there are some restrictions tied to them.
So are they parking, enterprise funds?
Yeah, let's just talk about the general fund performance. Those are to the bottom and they're non-discretionary. So we can program that as we see fit. If we wanted to change our financial policies or if we want to operationally review other things, or if we don't want to do anything, there's nothing to say we have to pull out the checkbook and start spending. And so the other reserves or excess from the enterprise funds, I believe they are pretty restricted and limited to those funding sources where they come from.
That is correct.
So just so I'm clear, so in this instance where we're talking about the income tax on slide 12, that would then go back to the general fund, just to make sure that I'm understanding that correctly.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Commissioner Moody?
I just want to ask two questions. One, on page 13, slide 25, where you talked about the Grand Rapids and the Wyoming unemployment rate. Is there any division between Grand Rapids and Wyoming? Do we report them constantly together all the time?
There is a division. The 2.9% is the Grand Rapids, Wyoming MSA. I believe if we look solely at the city of Grand Rapids, that is 4.1% as of August 19.
And that's based on ACS data.
You said 4.1%?
4.1, yes.
Say that last part again. That's overall?
That's purely city of Grand Rapids
City of Grand
overall.
And the 2 point,
The 2.9 was the city of Grand Rapids, Wyoming MSA.
okay. I just wanted to make sure that I understand that they could be separated.
Yes.
Because I wanted to know primarily what Grand Rapids is.
Certainly.
Second
And
thing
then-
I want to ask.
Oh, just one thing about the data related to unemployment. We also should remember that that 4.1 is citywide, but if you drill down into census tracts, you see quite a bit of discrepancy.
Yeah, that was my secondary question. I was going to ask if we have the data by zip code or something like that, so we can see more specifically how we're doing across the city.
We do have that. I'm looking for Ms. Glover. I think I saw a cut of the data before, and we can make sure we get that to you. Is that correct?
Yeah, and
Yes.
is that census tract?
Census block all the way down to census.
Hold on, Becky Jo, so that the public can hear the answers, you might have to come to the mic. I'm going to ask everyone to come to the mic if they're responding to questions.
I wanted to clarify it, how granular that data is, just so that we're all aware.
Yes, this data actually goes down to the census block level, which is the lowest level you can get down to. So we've got that.
Okay. And it's ACS data?
ACS data.
And the most recent then, is it up to
So the most recent,
2018?
yeah, 2018 comes out in 2 weeks.
Okay.
That gives us a 3 to 5, and so we'll have that. We've got it all the way up to 17 right now.
Okay, great. And then hopefully after the census next year, we'll have more accurate, valid data.
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks.
So city manager, I can wait until the 2018 data for the response, because I'd like to see the most recent data.
My next question was page 17, slide 33. At the bottom, last bullet point where the comment is made that, and I kind of going back on what Commissioner Connor had alluded to, and that is that you said that some economists are predicting that there will be a recession within 12 to 18 months. Some of the seminars I've been going to, some of the economists says there's not going to be a recession. So if there is a recession, is the city prepared to handle it in reference to its pension fund?
Correct. And there does seem to be some variation in terms of those predictions and the timing of the recession. I guess the thing to keep in mind, the economy is always cyclical, so it's more a matter of when and how deep the recession would be, not necessarily if it would occur. And I'm sorry, the second part of your question was in terms of the pensions?
Yeah, I was just going to say, buy bonds, that'll help us.
Yes, and I do believe that we do keep a very diversified pension fund to anticipate those type of things.
We do.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I just appreciate this analysis a lot. I think that we get to a good report like this because we passed a budget that was 40 million less than the year before, and we have conservative projections, and I want to affirm what Commissioner O'Connor is the drum that he's beating for us to look at those goals again, and I think now is a great time to do that so that future commissions can have similar happy conversations like this. The one question that I had was, that have we done some initial projections in terms of revenue from medical and recreational marijuana, and is that incorporated in this? And do we have any kind of preliminary estimates, or is that not a part of this at this moment?
We did preliminarily budget in the fiscal 20 to 24 fiscal plan. I don't remember off the top of my head what those amounts were, but I can certainly get those for you.
And as I recall, they were very, very conservative.
They were.
So there were the certainty of the licensing fees, but beyond the other economic impact, they were not very aggressive estimates.
And I'll add two things in response to Commissioner Part. It'd be nice to have a reminder to the commission that a significant amount of the funds from both medical and recreational marijuana, much of that goes back to the state
Right,
and to
yeah.
Lara. And so I think all of us have heard this input from residents. What are you going to do with all that marijuana money that's going to come in? I think it's really important for us to explain that the city doesn't get the bulk of those dollars. And so we have to be very thoughtful about how we respond to that, but make sure people don't have unrealistic expectations. And then secondly, in response to your first comment, I appreciate that since I believe Commissioner Kelly was here too, close around this time, but having sat around this table back in 2012 when we had zero money in our budget stabilization fund, and our only option was to cut, and a lot of people were impacted by that. It was a terrible time in our city, and I hope no commission in the future ever is in the same space we were in 2012 because we didn't really be mindful and thoughtful about making sure that we were prepared for bad times, knowing that they're going to come. Whether it's 18 months or 3 years from now, we know the economy is cyclical, and we know there will be a downturn, and I think it's incumbent on us to make sure we're prepared for that. So.
Yeah, I asked that question because we're going to get asked that question about marijuana revenue, and I think that it makes common sense to me to be conservative in our estimates about that, and then maybe someday we'll have some happy news around that as well. But I think that to send that message out to everybody is that we have no idea how this is going to affect our bottom line.
The more locations you improve, the more tax money you can collect, okay?
To the state and the county. And
But summarily, I guess, in terms of financial fitness, right now, with over, if you take the two reserves funds, we have over a third of our general operating fund banked or reserved, budgeted. And that is an amazing position to be in. Now, we have to determine, what we want to do with that from a policy perspective, but we're in pretty good condition.
And just to be clear, I'm not advocating to put, 60% of our taxpayer dollars away and not spend them on, doing good for people.
right. But I go back to earlier, let's find out what is best practice, what does impact our bond rating, noting that if we increase our bond rating, a significant amount of money across the board, not just this year, but into the future. So. All right, any final questions? All right, I'll turn it back to you, City Manager.
Thank you. Okay, I just want to be mindful mindful of the time, I know that there is a groundbreaking at 2, and some of you have expressed interest in participating in that, and so that might be a good time to take a natural break, about 5 minutes until or so. And so what we'll do now, we have 6 sections to go through. We'll talk about the performance in those areas as well as the horizon issues, and some of it, particularly around government excellence, will be revisiting the discussions that we just had. But the order is governmental excellence, then safe community, then mobility, and then we'll try to accomplish those before the 2 o'clock break, and then we'll come back afterwards and discuss economic prosperity, health and environment, and engage in connected community. So with that, I'll ask Assistant City Manager Matthews and our CFO to take us through the governmental excellence section.
Thank you, sir. Pardon me. So on governmental excellence, the reason that I have my friend Ms. Claren here is it kind of runs the gamut across a lot of segments of the organization, personnel, financial, technological. So you'll see us, we're going to be sharing the stage for this first piece. So when we talk about governmental excellence, we're going to run through the specific objectives, and these are highlights of some of the achievements over the past year. You all have a full list of those achievements in your packet if you want to reference that. We're going to start with equity, embedding equity. That started with the elevation and the creation of an equity office and really focusing our efforts across the organization to be very intentional about what it is that we do and how it is that we do our work in an equitable and thoughtful way. We also updated the budget process this past year. This would have been the second year, actually, that we've started to integrate equity into the budget planning process. And each year we continue to refine that and improve on our experiences. You're going to see some of that going into the budget this year as well. We've started building systems to be able to disaggregate the data that we're collecting from a performance standpoint by demographics. That's one of the big projects that Ms. Glover and her team have been working on, and you've seen some of the early results of that. We've, of course, passed the Human Rights Ordinance here over the past few months, which is a big step. And then continued the implementation on the Third Ward Equity Fund. The last piece was kind of an unexpected surprise during the course of this year. We were able to secure an additional $300,000 related to the River Project. The Kellogg Foundation has a specific interest in helping us find ways to ensure that that project is equitable in all phases, including starting with planning, moving into construction, as well as occupancy and the businesses that we're able to bring into that space. And at this point, I'll hand it over for fiscal sustainability.
Thank you. So for fiscal sustainability, one thing we've done is the trench repair work. This is work that is performed by the water and sewer departments. It used to be done by a third party. Now we've taken that in-house and are recognizing $500,000 worth of savings. Scott already mentioned before the $3 million we added to the pension funds and post-employment healthcare funds, and then we've also are recognizing $13 million in projected health insurance savings over the next 3 years as a result of switching our administrator.
So when we talk about employees, at the basic level, we've brought on 184 new employees over the past year, and that's a continued rolling process. I think I've had 2 come across my desk today, new hires that we're bringing on board. The bargaining contracts, of course, we were able to complete those, and we were able to implement some of our priorities in that process that I think are going to benefit the employees in general. We've continued to offer programs that will increase our ability to fill some of the hard-to-fill positions that we have. And we really wanted to start focusing the organization around the strategic plan, around the values, and we've had 2 leadership retreats to really focus on those discussions and start getting us all moving in a uniform direction.
And then under facilities and workspaces, we've been reinvesting in our infrastructure. Among the things we've been doing is the Calder restoration, just completed this fall, and then the HVAC here in City Hall upgrades. We also issued an RFP for MLK Lodge, and we completed an all-gender restroom and lactation room here in City Hall.
The next one covers a lot of ground. That's technology, performance management, and internal communications and data. Did you jump me there? It's a well-oiled machine. So, of course, the top of the list is we got the strategic plan adopted. We procured Socrata, which is our data analytics platform, and you've already seen some of those results. That's a big step. And part of that initiative, we were recognized as the nation's top data-driven city for some of the work that we're doing in that space. And then in terms of community-wide data, we, of course, passed a 5G ordinance this year, which hopefully is going to provide us some opportunities in the smart city space. Then we have the master plan, which I guess is neither fiscal nor. From a master planning perspective, those discussions continue. Of course, the first step in that, we were talking about the scoping, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the horizon issues, but the planning doesn't stop because the master plan is going to be updated. You all have seen the South Division Corridor Plan and the Southtown Plan come across in front of you on the dais. We were able to complete the age-friendly plan as well as our bicycle plan. So when we talked about what are the priorities, the things that we ought to be looking towards as we plan for the next budget, one of those is upgrades to the financial system. There's going to be a financial impact there as we go through that upgrade, but I believe that it's going to have big impacts for the organization as a whole, but it is something that we need to keep in mind. Citywide equity training, I just got an update from the equity office, and it looks like we're going to have the bulk, we'll have the bulk of the planning done, but we're going to be doing all of our top management are going to be going through that training before the end of this fiscal year. And the plan is to have all employees through equity training by the end of next calendar year. We mentioned the scoping of the master plan. We're continuing with the technology needs assessment. We've revived our IT steering committee and have started having discussions about what their role is going to be and really scoping out how technology is going to be able to enable us in the future. We have some key facilities that we've got to start taking a look at. 201 Market, Coldbrook, 1120, 509 Wealthy. As we start thinking about what our workplaces are going to look like moving forward, those are all buildings and properties that we need to start talking about what the future looks like. We've got to continue to be competitive in the area of recruitment and retention. Of course, getting the contracts through was a big step in that regard. We've had previous discussions about how that affects non-represented employees, but we also want to be more intentional about the way that we go through the compensation analysis process. So it's not something that happens once every 20 years, but we're effectively in a consistent process of evaluating classifications and classes of employees. We've placed a big priority on how we can improve our bond rating, and we're going to be more intentional about that going into the upcoming year. Continuing to integrate performance management with the budgeting process, and you'll see some of that again this year. Organizational development and staff training. One of the things that we were very thoughtful about this year is when we were able to fill our training position, we really reoriented that position more around organizational development. Training is a component, but if we're going to align the organization as a whole, every level of the organization around this strategic plan, then you're really talking about organizational development. And we're very happy to have Holly on board for that. Building security is something else that we've brought back to the front. My understanding is back in 2016, there were CEPTED reports on all of our major city facilities. Since 2016, we've seen at least half a dozen incidents in government complexes across the country. And we're starting to have conversations about how we can bring some of that back and ensure that our employees feel safe when they come to work every day. And then the last one is legislative affairs. For the first time, we have a legislative agenda. We've been having conversations with the legislative committee about being more proactive, and as the city managers put it, play more offense when it comes to our legislative plans. So that's something else that will continue going into the next planning cycle. With that, we'll open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Matthews and Ms. Claren. Let me also reiterate, I think the Holly he was referring to was Ms. Holly Young. If she could please stand, she's our new organizational development specialist, so we're glad to have her on board. Mayor, I'll turn it over to you and see if there are questions from your colleagues.
All right, thank you. Well, welcome, Holly. Good to have you. I'll start with a couple of questions, and I'll turn to my colleagues.
One other thing, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
As you do this. So, thank you. So we have a list of questions. As you look at the topics, the horizon topics, as they both have covered, the feedback that will be helpful to us from your own perspective, is just some thoughts around what are some of the most important topics in this area as we look at FY21, and is there anything, staff has done a lot of work in mining these topics, but is there anything that's not on the list that should be considered, and or are there topics that you think we should either remove or defer for future years? That's the specific feedback we'd like to get from you from this conversation.
Great, thanks. So I'll start with a comment and then a question. So one, I am astounded at how far we've come in 3 years around being data-driven and using analytics and moving to a digital platform. So that I know some of us who've been around this table for a long time, you probably are also impressed with the speed at which we've moved, and I just want to publicly give thanks to everyone who's worked so hard to move us forward. And then my question is, I'm curious if you could elaborate just a little bit more around, let's see, it's on slide 41, page 21. I'm curious if you could elaborate on the programs that we're doing to increase hard-to-fill positions. I know that too has been something that this body has talked about at length in the past, so I'm just curious if you could elaborate a little bit. What partners are we working with? I know lots of us have ideas that we've shared over the last couple of years, but if you could talk about that.
Sure, and I'd like to invite Ms. Foster up here as well to talk about that. What I can say, and we actually were just talking about this this morning a little bit, the definition of hard to fill changes over time based on the labor market. And some of the programs that we may have instituted even 2 or 3 years ago may not still be aimed at the right target. So those are some of the conversations that we're having, is where do we need to adapt? How do we use the tools that are available to us to be able to really target what we know is hard to fill right now? One of those examples, when we talk about the non-represented level, we've been through several recruitments. If you want to talk about hard-to-fill positions, that's one of the areas where we've placed an emphasis. But I'd like Des to talk a little bit about some of the other areas where we've been placing a focus.
And so, as far as
Got it.
there it is. So what we've been doing for some of the hard-to-fill positions, we have our skill trade stipend that we did about a year ago, and then we have our learn-to-earn positions. We have like 4 of those right now that we're recruiting at a different level, like even for the assessor's office, because you can't get people in the market with that license. So we do those learn-to-earn positions, and then of course with the police department, they have a learn-to-earn also with the police recruit, which we've put back in place in the last couple of years. And then we have an internship program that we're looking at rolling out hopefully by the first of the year. Okay. And you asked about our partners. Our partner is for that is GRCC, and we've been working with them and the state government for that. And then of course, we've been working with higher reach, but that's not so much for hard to reach or hard to fill positions. And then we also work with the internal departments that we have here. Our Communities Children, they're a partner with HR for filling some hard to fill positions, and they're going into a lot of those learn to earn positions. And then the last thing that we've done is our internship program. We have an internship program where we've made a 2-year commitment to employees, and they're here for 2 years, and we take them and have them go to different departments to learn the operations and then slide into positions here in the city.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. I'll start over here with Commissioner O'Connor and then Commissioner Lanier.
Thank you, Mayor. A couple. Fiscal sustainability one, the $13 million in projected healthcare savings, that's great news. What's the plan to allocate those funds? I mean, is that something we're going to use to pay down employee retirement healthcare liabilities, or is that something we're trying to return to employees? How do we anticipate those dollars being utilized in the future? I got a couple more questions, but you can answer that one first.
I think ultimately you would like to see it benefit the employees in the rates that we're able to use to stabilize the plan. So to taper off the cost of healthcare increases, and as we learn, those are projected. So we need to experience the plan, but those are estimated. So as we get better experience, we can see if there will be adjustments to the rates or plan design, or as you said, to fund some of the long-term liability. But those are all options.
Under the employee section, the 184 employees hired, is that a net number or a gross number?
That is the gross number. That's the number that have been brought on.
Okay, I just don't want
Right.
But not the people
Oh, it's
left.
not new, yeah, it's not on top of.
Okay, that's I just wanted to make, like, I
Yeah,
think that's
please
an important.
clarify.
Didn't approve 184 in the budget.
Yeah, I think that's important to note as our partners in the media are probably in the audience. And, if we've hired 184 people, that talk about ongoing expenses.
Yeah, good point. Commissioner Lanier?
My question is actually tied to that too. You're in my brain today, I guess. But mine is more closely tied to the timing. I know we have in the past had some concerns by departments about how long it takes to bring someone on board. So I'm curious to know if we're seeing a change in that, and then how is higher reach in that process going? I don't know if that's fully implemented across the city yet, or if it's just specific departments, but just curious to know updates on those two things.
Well, the latest data, and I'm looking back at Desiree because I don't know if it's changed since I last saw it. We've stayed pretty flat on the time to hire so far. We've had some conversations about what are the things that we can do in the process to continue to improve on that. When we speak about higher reach, so higher reach, we're part of a cohort, and we've started the pilot phase of the project, which is a select group of employee classes that we're using to give the process a test run. Mm-hmm. And we've gotten a lot of feedback as we've gone through that process. And I know that there are still folks who have questions about how that might be implemented in an organizational-wide fashion. The one thing that we want to do, because the intent of the program is true, you want to have the best candidates on the list for the job, regardless of their background. But we've got to be very thoughtful in the way that that gets rolled out to the organization and the transparency by which we roll it out to the organization, because ultimately it's not us, and it's actually not HR that has to own the process. It's the hiring managers that have to own the process. Mm-hmm. So that's the conversation that I've been having with HR, is how do we circle back around and really get the hiring managers rallied around this idea and participating in it now that we've run this initial pilot and gotten some valuable feedback. Our goal remains to continue down that path in the coming year. But it's not going to be done at all costs. We want to make sure that every step is successful along the way.
Can I add to that? So I think timing, in this age, should be competitive with talent. You have to be able to move fast. Mm-hmm. And the last I recall, we had like a 90-day turnaround, and we were around 70 days, which is on average, but that means some go faster, some go slower, but we need to be very nimble. And part of that is the challenge of the current culture. We have a system that's built on process. And so what you have with the current system, for example, particularly for civil service, it's a civil service process. Higher reach is a system that's built on values. And so we are trying to put something that's built on values into a process that may have not been built on values, and so there are things that need to be ironed out. So it's a pilot. Where other organizations, particularly in the private sector, if they're coming up with a new system built on values, they just change their values and everything aligns with it. Where we have very governmental, we have some charter requirements, we have civil service requirements, and so that means that we have to revisit the infrastructure in which we have to make sure that both systems align. And so I think we're getting good feedback where there's been some good alignment and some opportunities to improve. But we ultimately have to make a decision as an employer. We're going to be values-driven or process-driven, or ideally, how do we innovate and build a system a process that is values-driven.
Yeah, I did notice on a posting that I recently looked at where it had the timeline. It was pretty lengthy. I can't even remember which position it was, but I think even that's a step in the right direction, because if you're applying, then you kind of know this is going to take about this long, as opposed to thinking you're applying and within 60 days you're hearing from someone, or, the decision has been made. So I think that that's helpful. It would be great to have further conversation at the civil service level, because we've had many conversations ourselves about how to reduce tests, how to get rid of tests, how to get rid of antiquated questions on tests. So, it will be a fun conversation to see how to blend the higher reach concept into the requirements that exist through civil service and the charter. And then I had a secondary question. It was tied to, I think, your question, City Manager, the questions you have embedded on slide 44. So the items that are on slide 43, are those the only horizon topics that will be coming before us today?
Those are
Or
Each topic.
Within
pillar.
governmental excellence, so at the end
Okay.
of each section, there's going to be a
then there'll
list
be
of-
these, okay. Okay, thanks. Well, I guess, let me just add this, because we briefly talked about the Third Ward Equity Fund within governmental excellence, that I am interested in an expansion of some sort to that. Very appreciative of the start and the implementation of that, but just hopefully we can have a conversation about expanding that sometime soon before the budget is created.
I think it's under economic prosperity. So
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, it's in
it
both
was
areas.
mentioned on
As
slide
accomplishment.
40. Yeah, so since it was mentioned here, I thought I could mention it with your questions on slide 44.
So we'll certainly want to have that discussion very deliberately when we discuss the economic prosperity section, to talk about some of these horizon topics, but we note it now.
Thank you.
Commissioner Park?
Yeah, just
And then Commissioner
mostly just a few comments. I just want to applaud the efforts with higher reach. I know that rolling it out is going to take some time, but when you think that we had 184 positions turnover, that's 10% of the workforce with the city, and so it still remains one of the absolute greatest opportunities for our city to make sure that we're hiring the right people and getting them in the right positions. And from what I know of higher reach, it's just going to lead to excellent outcomes for the city with regards to quality of people, less turnover, and more diversity. So I just want to highlight that. One of the things that's not in the short list of outcomes for governmental excellence is this embedding equity in the budgeting process. And so I do look forward to seeing that when it comes back to us in April, each department, how they're going to tie that to that. One thing that has been discussed, and I think I'm interested in some sort of an experiment this year, is picking an item in the general fund for a participatory budgeting exercise with the community. Clearly, that's got to be rolled out slowly. You can't just jump all the way to that, but is there something this year that we can experiment with in terms of involving the community in the budgeting process beyond this group of people? And then I just want to affirm, in terms of most important topics on the horizon, getting this data out there and these dashboards, I think that's just going to it's just going to make things so much better for us as an elected official, being able to give answers to people, but also it's going to satisfy a lot of the desire of the community along the way. So just, I appreciate that being high on the list.
Can I ask for
Go.
clarification? I want to make sure the participatory part in the community, obviously you have the formal part during the budget deliberations after the budget's proposed for the public hearing and giving feedback. And I'm assuming you're talking more upstream when, for instance, like the Parks Department, for example, as they propose their budget, they're working with the Parks Advisory Board and others in the community to give feedback. But are there other specific things, or we have on our Stormwater Commission or Vital Streets Commission, we have community participation there, but is there something else that you are referencing where you think additional community engagement would be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, maybe an easy example is right now, Commissioner Lanier, Commissioner Kelly, and I sit on the CDBG group that decides on how we're going to allocate those funds. So it's the three of us making that decision about how we're going to allocate those funds. I think we did a great job these last 2 years. But the community may have some different opinions about, we prioritized this year providing gap funding for affordable housing projects, and so we were able to give some money to these bigger projects to fill in those gaps. That's just one example of something that could be opened up for a broader conversation. And I don't think it necessarily, there's a million ways you can do it, I think.
Right.
So.
Okay, well, that's good, that's helpful. We'll think about that.
Yeah. All right, and I'll add, and then I'll turn to Commissioner Moody. Commissioner, I appreciate what you said about higher reach and the potential impact that could have. And I do think probably it's worthwhile for this body to have a conversation. I feel like over the years, we've talked about civil service a number of times. In fact, dating all the way back to Commissioner White, who actually thought there should be some pretty dramatic changes to civil service because he saw some downfalls to the current process. It's probably worth this entire body talking about that and getting an update on higher reach. Higher reach hasn't been utilized in public settings. In fact, we are one of the kind of we're kind of at the cutting edge of that work. I've talked to the folks over there a number of times, and I think there's a lot that we could learn, and we could actually be a leader in this space. And so that might be just an item we want to put on a list of items to come back and have a larger conversation with the full commission around that. Commissioner Moody?
Yeah, page 22, slide 43. Bullet point 2, your citywide equity training. Will the city be doing the training, or will we be contracting it out? And if we are contracting it out, is that included in our budget?
The intent is that it'll be a blended program, but the intent is to bring on a third party that's going to help get that work done. My understanding at this point is that for this year, we have funding in the budget. When you talk about implementing something that's going to touch every employee in the organization, as the 184 number indicates, there's a tail on the program just by virtue of the turnover in the organization. So there will be some ongoing funding, regardless of how much we're able to get done in this fiscal year. And the equity team right now is working to really refine what that's going to look like for FY21. But we're funded for this year to be able to start that work.
Start this year?
Yes, this fiscal year.
But this will be ongoing?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So that is an investment decision, as Mr. Matthews said, that will have to be made. And you have various models. You have some model where you get the consultant to design and then to begin the implementation, and it's train to trainer where you cascade it down in the organization, and others where it's total delivery from beginning to end, in which ends up costing more for consultant services. So we are very preliminary in terms of our evaluation of it, and it would have to go through a competitive process and scope it out to make sure that we're before we bring the recommendation back.
Thank you. All right, final comment by Commissioner Lanier, Commissioner Kelly, and then we'll move on.
Just on building security, I just want to say I'm appreciative of that being highlighted. We just had, sadly, a couple more mass shootings, and it says courthouse doesn't have guns in the chambers, for example, and in the building,
Or federal
and we
building.
do. So I just really appreciate that we're going to take a hard look at that.
Well, we've thought about all the discussions we've been having to other community organizations to improve crime prevention, and I don't want to speak too much about the risk assessment here, but there are certainly opportunities to improve, and I think we, as Mr. Matthews said, we've started some of that implementation.
Great, thanks. All right.
Thank you.
I think we're ready to move on.
Okay, thank you. All right, we will.
City Manager, sorry,
Yes.
I just had one clarification point. Commissioner Repper, I just wanted to let you know that building equity into the budget is included as one of the Horizon topics. It's not specifically called out, but the performance management and budget process integration, a big component of that is around equity in that process. So.
And thank you. You will be hearing from Sutter occasionally as our QA/QC person on anything we might miss. Thank you for that. We will move now to our section on safe community, and we're going to ask Fire Chief, Police Chief, and our Performance Office of Accountability to come and give us an update.
Welcome, Chief. Chief, Brandon.
All right, as I start the discussion on safe community, I want to draw your attention to the definition that we use for safe community. And that is that all people feel safe and are safe at all times throughout our community. And we're going to go over some accomplishments that we had in this last fiscal year. And those accomplishments are going to be handled by objectives. So objective 1 on emergency preparedness. In 2019, the Grand Rapids Fire Department became one of 348 organizations across the nation that was a ISO Class 1.
Yay.
We hired an emergency management administrator who is now on staff, and we look forward to working with her throughout this fiscal year. We initiated a two-factor authentication pilot project for the police, which will increase security to critical systems accessed remotely or via cloud-based services. And then under emergency response, which is an objective, we responded in a timely and effective manner to storm activities. Under recovering from emergencies, we used our experiences from our polar vortex to aid in the recovery from the September 2019 storm event, and we were able to pivot off of that to be able to help us to move forward. And now I'll turn it over to Chief Payne to talk about the next slide.
Thank you. And some of the accomplishments, I think we're on. We completed the Hillard Hines deployment study, hired a police chief, deputy chief, and 24 officers, and promoted 11 other police officers. To Commissioner O'Connor's point, that's 2 additional positions added to our staffing. Those were replacements. But we also created 3 civilian positions that, from the subpoena specialists, special services unit, and property management. And the plan is, or we're in the process of hiring those civilians, and so that we could move officers that are currently serving in those positions into the back to uniform and to complete our afternoon community police specialist team. We held the first ever Women's Summit, created Office of Oversight and Public Accountability, and named the interim director. You hear more about that. We implemented a foreign national policy, and it was one of the first times I know of where we've actually asked the community to come in and actually provide input on that policy as we created it. We established the crime prevention through environmental design ordinance and strategies. And also created an enforcement framework and began implementation of the residential rental application fee ordinance. Then some Horizon topics. Did you want to, I can cover them.
Start with the first two.
Yeah. Crime prevention and enforcement technologies. With that Hillard Hines study, it came back that we had adequate number of officers. With that said, I think through crime prevention and technology, we have opportunities that exist in other communities that we've been exploring, looking at, that will help in to reduce our violent crime that is occurring. Such things as drones and ShotSpotter, real-time crime centers. Those are being implemented in other cities. Police staff and deployment, we have to continue to look at how we're deploying our officers. Accountability and community trust has to be at the forefront of what we're doing. And along with that, the open data and transparency. Working with the emergency manager, newly hired, in preparing for emergencies, and we have to keep our eye on the homeless. We've been in discussions on models that exist throughout other cities where we can hopefully address the homeless situation in the city. And human trafficking, it's something that we have a task force that we're working with that group. We have to keep an eye on that. It exists, and hopefully be able to have the ability to impact that.
I think just before we go on to the questions, I believe the fire chief, do you want to share information on our emergency preparedness? And I think
Sure.
Mr. Davis is also going to share some update on the accountability office.
So under emergency preparedness, we want to also acknowledge the fact that we'll be working on assessing our risk in the community, training our people. My handout that came around to you was on the IEMC course that is a grant-funded course through the federal government. The last time Grand Rapids prepared in that manner was in 1985. We'll be taking on that challenge in 2019 or in 2020 in April. And that will be 75 of our not only city staff, but also community partners that will be engaged in that training. We'll also be looking at best practices across the field of emergency management for the city of Grand Rapids. And then I can tell you also under homelessness that we're working right now with our community stakeholders to impact the issues that we have in front of us. We are actively participating in the support of the Chronic Inebriant Center. And then there's a FUSE initiative which is happening through our work with the Dwelling Place and the Corporation for Supportive Housing, which is coming in to try and also engage us to organize around a FUSE model, which would be a frequent user system engagement model.
So, Commissioners, the other thing I've talked with both fire chief and police chief about is being very deliberate about our response to homelessness in terms of service calls for service. And instead of deploying fire apparatus and officers to the scene, that we perhaps want to think about a homeless outreach response team, a street team like other communities, and have a dedicated officer, a dedicated firefighter, a dedicated person from the community, partnering with community, working in a very mobile way to be the first, to be part of the first response to calls that we know relate to homeless communities, to assess, to help manage, to refer, to even have a dedicated vehicle to assist in mobility efforts with that community. So, and I think we have one more highlight.
Sure. So as we talk about accountability and community trust, it's clear that this commission has specifically called out accountability in the strategic plan as one of the values of the city. And when we talk about that, it's defined as always acting with integrity and transparency and being responsible for what we say and do. So as we talk about the Office of Public Accountability and Oversight, we have to first look at best practices. And we've looked at the National Association for the Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, which are the national leaders in the area of civilian oversight. And they work to help communities build best practices based off of the needs of that community. It's centered around 6 competencies of training, and it talks about civilian oversight of law enforcement, about working with the public and transparency, as well as looking at law enforcement policies, amongst other things. There's really 3 traditional models of civilian oversight. One is the review model, and the review model simply is similar to like a volunteer board. And you review closed investigations. So when you think of a review model, you think of like our civilian appeals board process. Each model has its own strengths and weaknesses. You think about a review model, one of the strengths is it does include some community involvement, and it's usually one of the least expensive models. But one of the weaknesses is that there's usually not a lot of teeth behind it, and oftentimes community feels disenfranchised from the process because they don't have the same level of decision-making authority as some other models have. The next model that's fairly common is the auditor-monitor model. The auditor-monitor model is unique because it looks at systems. So instead of looking at individual cases of misconduct, it generally focuses on the system. So the departments as a whole, looking for patterns and trend. It's based off of data analysis. So the strength behind that, obviously, is it goes to the data of the entire department that you're talking about, as opposed to an individual situation. However, the weakness is oftentimes community feels like those major issues that they hear reporting about are not being handled by the agency that's put in place to do civilian oversight. So we also talk about an investigative model. The investigative model is a model that does just what its name says. It essentially takes all of the investigative authority away from Internal Affairs Division, usually, and then does all of the investigations internally. So a weakness of that is it can make a police department feel disenfranchised or not trusted. A strength of that is oftentimes community feels like there's a more transparent process, and they don't feel the same struggle that they sometimes feel about policing police. So when you talk about the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, they've made it very clear that those are the traditional methods, and when you look at other cities across the country, many times you'll see those 3 because they've been around the longest, but they recommend a hybrid version now that essentially takes the strengths from each of the models we've already talked about and combines it to try to eliminate the weaknesses in a way that's completely tailor-made in partnership with community and other stakeholders for the community that we're dealing with. So in this case, for Grand Rapids, that model generally should include the 12 core competencies and elements of civilian oversight. So when you talk about those 12, you're talking about independence. And that means that the oversight agency is able to make decisions free of politics, essentially. Then you talk about adequate jurisdictional authority. And what that means is that the oversight agency has enough authority to go in and look at the right cases, right? To look at the cases that make a difference in community or that matter to community. The third part of that is unfettered access, which means that in order for an agency, and the chief and I have talked about this quite a bit, but in order for an agency to do its job well, it has to have access to the records of public safety. If an oversight agency can't get the access, it's going to be very difficult to do that systemic research or to look at those individual cases in order to make change. Then we talk about access to law enforcement, executive level staff, and internal affairs. And I'm very grateful that both chiefs have already made themselves available, and also their executive leaders had an opportunity to meet with all of them as well. You also need support from the process from stakeholders. So that means making sure that community and all the other stakeholders are involved in the process and understand the process going forward. We talk about public reporting and transparency. So that means that the office needs to make sure there's reporting in a way, utilizing technology as we've already started to talk about, but that makes clear what's happening, that everything to the extent that the law allows is made public. We talk about use of statistical data analysis, which we've already covered a little bit. Then there's community outreach, community involvement, and then making sure you respect confidentiality. So as we talk about all of those things, we're really at the phase with this office where we're talking about next steps. Up to this point, there's been involvement with law enforcement leaders, that being the chiefs and their deputy chiefs, as well as some leaders in community. But we're moving towards the stage of more intentional engagement, which will include conversations with the unions and conversations with other members of community and development of a collaborative design team, which will allow us to then build out what a model looks like for Grand Rapids. And after that, we'll come back to report to commission.
Good.
Thank you. Welcome, Commissioner. Yeah.
Okay, Mayor, if we can go to the next slide. So again, what are some of the topics that you think are most important? Anything that's missing from the list and things that should be removed?
Well, I'll add just two things. One, Commissioners, if you're not familiar with the FUSE model that Chief Lehman referenced, I'm happy to send you some information. Dwelling Place is the lead organization on this. I know the Downtown Development Authority just supported some funding for this. This model is a really incredible model. It's had some great impact and outcomes in other cities, and it basically identifies the highest utilizers and creates a really robust and comprehensive holistic wraparound to try to meet the needs of those individuals, everything from housing to substance use to mental health support. And so I'm eager to see it launched here in our city, and then for us to be a partner in that space. And I know that both the police department and the fire department have been working really closely with Dwelling Place on this, and I just want to say thank you to both your teams for that. So, and then I'll just add for the last slide, 48, two topics I would like us to at least consider adding. One, what is our plan and what are we doing around the opioid epidemic? I know we have a partnership with Red Project on that. All of us are well aware of that epidemic, not just in our community, but in other communities. And I just want to make sure that we are well aware of what our departments are doing to address that. And then this is a little bit related to homelessness, but separate. And I know the chief, the police department and fire department have been working with the county on this as well. But I want to keep on our priority list what we're doing around diversion and diverting individuals from jail and ERs. I know the county is currently looking at a feasibility around a 23-hour crisis center. We've been, I think we were briefed on that about a year ago. It still remains a priority to me. I think it's much needed in our community, but I just think we should keep our eye on those two topics as well. Commissioner O'Connor?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. As to the stuff from last year, just one quick touch on the SEPTED ordinance and strategy. I know we talked last year about whether or not we're going to add a uniformed officer as sort of the relationship officer, sort of like a community officer for those businesses that are habitual offenders of our ordinance. So just want to make sure that's still out there. And then as it relates to upcoming topics for Horizon topics, I mean, two things for me would be gang violence and gun violence. I mean, I think those are both paramount. I had the fortune to do a ride-along last week with our city manager and Deputy Chief Reifenberg, and, you know, some of the gang stuff is it's incredible, and the more you dive into it, the uglier it is, as well as the gun violence stuff. And then as it kind of relates to the fire department, we talk about homelessness, we talk about sustainability, we talk about investing in things that have good outcomes, we talk about equipment, is ambulance service, whether or not we should be running an ambulance service for some of our facilities, knowing that we roll out we just approved some budget for new fire trucks. Those things are big and expensive and cost a lot of money to either pick up someone who's inebriated or to, especially in the far reaches of the first ward where we have a lot of service calls to our retirement communities. Is that the best, long-term strategy? And whether or not we should be thinking about having some of those services in-house where we then probably could get reimbursed from the federal government for taking people to the hospital.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. And next to Commissioner Lanier and then Commissioner Kelly. Go ahead.
So thanks, everyone, for your presentations.
Yeah, let's get there.
I have a couple quick comments. I'm guessing that you all are familiar with the change in this Heartside Clinic that will be closing by the end of this year. So I'm curious to know, how is that going to impact your work? I know many are saying that, we'll probably have an influx in incidents and things of that nature with the closure. I think Cherry Street Health Services is able to absorb some of the clients who were going to the Heartside Clinic, but I think that percentage was less than 50. So I'm just curious to know if the group that you're on, if you all are talking about it and trying to come up with solutions to address what potentially could be an influx in servicing, going back to your point about being an ambulance and servicing people on the street in the Hartside area.
Yeah, unfortunately, that'll drive the numbers at the emergency rooms, but Mel Trotter is also adding some nursing staff to try and accommodate for those people that are associated with their organization. So there are people trying to pick up a couple of the pieces, but it's definitely going to have an impact on that community, and it's going to drive ER wait times. It's going to kind of stress the system a little bit, so we'll have to wait and evaluate what those impacts are.
Okay. It's good to know it's on your radar and trying to address it. And then, thanks, Chief, for your comments about human trafficking, and we appreciate your participation, Lieutenant Wu's participation. Bill was just with us last week when we met, and we're happy that he's still connected with his airport connection now, so thank you all for that. And then, Brandon, I have a question about the, I'm guessing you were kind of referring to some of the information that was passed out while you were talking about the different oversight practices.
Sure.
And so I'm curious to know if we have any cities within Michigan who have this hybrid model that you're describing. I know, sometimes from state to state, there are different laws that may prevent you from being able to do exactly what happens in other cities. So I'm just curious to know if we have a hybrid model, an oversight model that's a hybrid, similar to what you described in any city here in Michigan.
No, so the cities that have oversight in Michigan are newly is Ann Arbor, so they're still figuring out their model.
Okay.
But right now, there's a community board that's looking to expand beyond that size.
Okay.
Then there's Detroit that has a police commission. So a commission takes a different effect than a hybrid model, but because they are a commission, they have a lot of the same authority that comes with a hybrid model. And then there's also a few other boards in other cities, like Muskegon has a board, and Lansing has some accountability work, but they don't have full-run hybrid model offices. They have more like review models.
Okay, similar to our Civilian Appeals Board.
Similar to Civilian Appeals Board, with the exception of Detroit.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
All right, Commissioner Kelly?
I want to thank you, too, for all your work in this. I know that we talked earlier, I think it was last year, about what's going on in the South Division area and the repeat calls and our need to connect the dots with our hospitals and the police department, fire department, so really appreciate that. And I'm sure that this is probably embedded in it, but I hope that we can really take a look at mental health, because we've heard about that not only with the homelessness, we've had those conversations around panhandling. Our district court has indicated that they say around 70% of the folks that are involved in both of those arenas do have mental health issues. So hopefully we are also in some way including our district court in these conversations. They're doing some good work too, of course, in drug prevention and eviction prevention, which fits into the homelessness care category here. So that's great. I'm really impressed with the conversation you just are having here around the oversight, independent oversight, and that it would include the community and the police department, because obviously we're all trying to build those relationships and to build a model that fits everybody's needs and be very transparent about that. It's excellent. So that's exciting. And then finally, I know that in terms of crime prevention, our neighborhood organizers, at least in the Second Ward, and we meet with them on a regular basis, have been talking now for some time about really rethinking the crime prevention work that they do. It doesn't fit as well as it did in the past with the community development model that they are working under and have to report to, and they want to focus less on neighborhood watching and enforcement and more on prevention and keeping people out of the system. We've had some situations similar to what we've heard in the news about people calling in reports about people, for example, and I know at least in Creston, they struggled with a neighbor who was, well, there were some racial implications there, and so they're looking for some support and training in a different direction that they've had before, so that they are able to do more around prevention and keeping people out of the system.
Thanks, Commissioner. Anyone else? Commissioner
Just
O'Connor?
one last rant on this just came to me because I know we've had some, Commissioner Repart and I have had some conversations with some of our neighborhood folks, and maybe it belonged, or maybe it'll be under mobility next. Never mind, I'll wait till the next topic.
Okay. Commissioner Repart?
Yeah, I just want to make sure to take a moment, so many, particularly for you, Chief Payne, I mean, so many recommendations have been handed to the department, and I'm sure that feels relentless. And I just want to make sure to say that I appreciate the commitment to take that on head on, to say we're going to be the best, we're going to keep working through this. And I see this list, and I hope that City Manager Washington, this full list of achievements will get made available, because it's really significant, the amount of work that the GRPD undertook in the last year. And, like we always say, there's always more work to do, but I just want to make sure to express my appreciation for the receptiveness, openness to trying new things, and for the way that we really have been chipping at those recommendations. Unfortunately, we have many, so we've got to keep going with it, but I just really appreciate that effort.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Moody and then Commissioner Jones.
Yeah, I too want to echo what my colleague just said in reference to the work that's been done on this. I want to go back to safe communities for example. On 48 highlight, we talked about human trafficking. I've never seen any reports of human trafficking mentioned anywhere, either on the news or are there people being arrested for human trafficking, or are we looking at one or two people that might be prostituting 2 or 3 ladies? When I think about human trafficking, I'm thinking about a well-planned organization that traffics women.
Yes, sir. We have seen that here in Grand Rapids, and we've also met with people who are, for lack of better terms, monitoring massage parlors and different things like that, where we believe it's occurring there. We have had investigations of the massage parlors and also at residents.
And
We don't
Chief,
have anything that's in place to prevent it, do we not? From a city standpoint, I know Commissioner Lanier is working on something, they're working with different groups. Are there other groups out there that we're working with as a city to prevent this?
So, Commissioner, I think if you look at what's happening in other growing communities where that are either border states or kind of tourist or event kind of communities, there's a collaborative effort that not just the city's leading. It's a combined effort with the city, with the county, with hotel community, with businesses, and it begins with broad awareness. And I think we're partnering on that. But to your earlier question, in Grand Rapids specific data, we'll have to see what we can mine, but it's really an area problem and not just a city problem, and I don't know what data we've been tracking that we could report on it, but we'll have to.
Might look into that. We've also partnered with the state police on a few occasions. Actually, it's yearly that we run an operation that focuses on human trafficking, but it's always on our mind. I will encourage people to report it, and it will be investigated.
And if I can just add too, and the FBI primarily addresses human trafficking, because human trafficking, there are definitions specific to coercion for people who may be of legal age to give permission or to consent, but they may be coerced into doing it. But then there's also children, minors who cannot give that type of consent. And so the FBI is a primary agency that addresses human trafficking across the nation, and in partnership with local law enforcement agencies too.
Chief, maybe you can speak to the multi-jurisdictional team that looks specifically at sexual violence that includes other other departments and the sheriff's department. And then there's also a countywide human trafficking multidisciplinary group that gets together, and then there's some nonprofits in town that specifically work to support victims.
We have officers assigned to ICAC is mainly for computer generated crimes against children. It works with the state police. But again, and thank you, Commissioner, there's a local FBI agent, former GRPD officer actually, who specializes in trafficking that we have a very close relationship with, and I believe he sits on your board. And so we're working with multiple agencies, both private. I've met with a private group who are looking at West Michigan in general with the massage parlors. So we're working with multiple groups. It's on our radar. We will investigate it if we find out about it.
Mike, can I ask one more question in reference to human trafficking? Because I think this is important. I think that a lot of times we also look at human trafficking also deals with drug use. So you have a lot of those young lady or men are on opioids. I think that plays a very important part. I guess my biggest concern is Grand Rapids. Where are we with this in Grand Rapids? And so it's good for me to hear that. I know that Commissioner Lanier is doing a lot. But it's good for me to hear that there are some things in place that the city is doing. I think that's important. I was just wondering, I have not seen any data in terms of arrests or in terms of places in the city where these things are taking place. And I think hotels and conventions are good spots for this stuff to take place at and with.
Yeah, that's a great point. And maybe we can get an update
Sure,
in the future. I know that the public awareness campaign launched probably about a month ago, and so there's a lot of awareness and education happening right now. So, Commissioner Jones?
Thank you, Mayor. I want to begin by telling Chief Lehman I can't say enough about the hiring of the Emergency Management Administrator. I think that that's it's a timely move, but it was also, I think, a rather strategic move, just based on, and I think that's the overall theme that I want to speak to is just, staying with the times. We're living in a day when having that type of expertise is critically important because of the times that we're living in and the fact that, whether it's a natural disaster or just someone who's taken upon themselves to want to create chaos, that's good to be able to have someone that we can turn to who can help facilitate during those times of crisis. And so I want to recognize you for that. And also want to, as stated by my colleague, Commissioner Rephart, just kudos to you, Chief Payne, and the department for just your steadfastness, again, staying with the times. I know that a lot is being asked of you and of the department. A lot is coming from members of community in terms of what their expectations are, and I just think that you all are doing a really good job of juggling all that. Again, during a time in which, there's a lot that's being said, there's a lot that's being suggested, and I just want to commend you on your leadership and the work that you're doing with the department. And to Brandon, I want to say, just continue to. I'm excited about where this is going, especially as it pertains to a hybrid model, because to your point, there are models that have been in play for years throughout the country, but again, in staying with the times, there's a need to be more strategic and more thoughtful about creating a model in which you're never going to be able to please everyone, but the ability to try to get to a place where people can recognize the transparency, people can recognize the fact that they had an opportunity to share their voice, and also doing what we can to make sure that we are doing all that we can to make sure that our officers feel safe as well. And so I want to thank you for your work, and I'm excited about where this is going and what we're finding around best practices. So thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. Any final thoughts before we take a break, Commissioner?
I
Oh,
just
I'm
have a
sorry,
quick
and then City
question.
Manager wants to speak.
Quick question about, we have a FEMA document, a shot spotter, and something else about drones. Is this just for reading purposes? I want to make sure I don't miss what I'm supposed to do with those.
The FEMA document is the upcoming class that we have in April. It's just for your information. It's not, it's something that city staff are going to be involved with, but it was just for you to know what's happening.
In the shot spotter and drones, as I mentioned, I'm in discussions with the city manager about resources
Okay.
and how we can impact violent crime, and that is something that we've seen throughout other communities that they've utilized to impact violent crime.
Okay, thank you.
If I could, Mayor, elaborate, I think the chief, as we look at deployment, we want to Commissioner Jones' point, stay strategic and look at response times, and I think drone technology has helped with faster, at least observational response times in other communities while simultaneously perhaps deploying other resources. And we're aware of the conversations that community has had in the past and the department has had in the past about trust and privacy, and we're working through those issues and doing some education with some community members, and we've had those conversations. So I think the chief and I wanted you to be aware at least what the technology is, and we're continuing to work through the concerns of both the department and community around that. Around to Commissioner Connor's point earlier around gang violence and the observations we saw with some of the activity and SEPTED, I think what we want to continue to find creative ways to deploy and dispatch officers by a combination of things, both through the continued implementation of deployment study where it makes sense to add resources. It is civilian resources that would allow officers to increase patrol, or to a combination of technology and or additional budgeting. So that continues to be the puzzle we try to solve, and we will continue to develop the right portfolio as we prepare the budget recommendations. But certainly we want to make sure, as Chief Lehman said earlier, that everybody feels safe, and there's numerous ways to improve the level of safety and comfort, and you've heard that from all three of them today.
Great. Thank you. So is that a good time to break?
Well, we have one other section on mobility.
You know, you can keep going. I am going to get over there early only because I'm speaking.
Okay. Okay. Can we go 5 more minutes?
Yes. I'm gonna scoot out, but please go 5 more minutes, and then I will meet you over there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's go. I think there's several other people who need to get away then, Mayor.
Yeah.
We'll go ahead and break and try to come back at what time?
Let's break and come back at 3.
All right, I guess we're now back in session.
Okay. Thank you. And the other commissioners and the mayor are still at the MSU groundbreaking, and they're about to conclude. Thank you for those who were able to attend, and the staff as well. Thank you for your contribution in making that a reality. Right before we adjourn, we were talking about the drone technology, and there were a couple of questions afterwards. I just, for the sake of the public, just to clarify, I know the fire department currently uses aerial support for fire suppression, and I'll let the chief talk a little bit, fire chief talk a little bit about that, but the police department does not utilize it. We have no aerial support resources within the department that if there's ever a need for air support, we have to work with state police, and that there's a delay in getting that resource here in Grand Rapids. And the drone technology would allow the police department to effectively have a heliport on top of the department and to deploy a drone within our 44 square miles, and we estimate the drone could be dispatched there within 2 to 3 minutes, which is could even exceed or beat officers arriving on the scene to get some visualization of what's happening on the ground. So, Fire Chief, if you would briefly explain how it's being used in the fire department, and Police Chief, if you could expound a little bit after that.
Sure.
And our challenge right now is that in our program, we're able to utilize that drone technology to give us immediate vision for the incident commander on the scene. Where we lack, but where we're trying to enforce or reinforce that program is to obtain real-time imaging into our emergency operations center so that we can make, larger scale decisions. Right now, our use of the drone is being used for situational awareness. So during storm activity, during ice jamming, during incident scenes where we can get a better visual from a higher altitude and give us information that we don't currently have by just sitting on the ground. That's where we're utilizing that information right now. And I do think that the program that the chief of police is going to talk to would benefit both police and fire and both emergency services. So I'm anxious to entertain that going forward.
And part of it, it's not just crime fighting that we would utilize the drone for. As city manager said, it would be used for crime fighting, not for crime fighting, but crime prevention. When we have incidents, and it would be high priority calls. Those would be the type of calls that it would be dispatched on. But the other ways we would utilize it, of course, with fire being involved, we could assist with the fire department, our forensic services unit in mapping out crime scenes that occur that are large areas. We could utilize it for that. And then our traffic reconstruction is, when we have a fatal accident, it takes multiple hours for our technicians to go out and measure out and to diagram the intersections where it occurs. This would cut, we believe, up to 75% of the time that we would not have to close down no major intersections. And it also would free up officers who have to go back and plot all those things using computer software. The drones would be utilized to do that. The other part of it too, Commissioner, I mentioned to you, this is another eye in the sky on accountability of officers. It will allow me to see how the officers are performing out there also. So there's a lot of different components. It's not just crime prevention that we would utilize the drone for.
So in addition to the camera footage that's already available from DASH, from in-car, as well as the body cam footage that officers have whenever they're responding to priority one calls and draw their weapons, this would be additional footage that both would be there to protect both officers as well as the public in reviewing any critical incidents on priority one type of calls.
Absolutely. It's another point of observation where I can see and accountability of officers, how they're performing out there. We would utilize it for training too, to make sure officers are responding to calls in the proper way. So it's not just the crime aspect of it. There's many different ways where we would utilize the drone to gather information.
I think it's important to note too, this isn't duplicating current technology. Our drone system, it utilizes pilots and spotters in order to operate. This type of technology would be utilized with a drone that is an automatically flown drone that would respond to incident scenes before we even got on scene, to give us that advantage of being able to have a more rapid response and kind of information that is fed back to us immediately.
So Commissioners, this again, it's just information, no decisions today, but I just wanted to do a little bit more elaboration so that there can be a common understanding of what the technology is in potential uses.
City Manager, may I ask one question? Sure. My question is in concern with surveillance. Will these drones be surveilling the community? Not just when you get a call, but are they being used to patrol the community?
No, sir. They would be specific to a specific call, whether it's a fire call or a priority one call. And what we would also do, part of this, the company we've talked to, we would publish the flight path of that drone. So anyone can see where that drone went and how it performed and where it was at. and that's part of being transparent about it. We would not use it for any type of just normal surveillance or just putting it out there to put it out there. It would be specific to it would be attached to an incident.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Chiefs. Now, I think in this next section, Mr. DeLong was supposed to be part of it, but I bet Josh is very capable of continuing until he arrives.
I'll do my best. I might not get it verbatim, but so just continuing in the vein of the earlier session before the break, just wanting to highlight some of the accomplishments we had from the first. Oh, here we go.
Have a seat, sir.
Right there?
Do you want me to pause for 1 second? Then?
Does anybody else want any candy or popcorn or anything?
There are some snacks and coffee as well.
Where the snacks and coffee? Yes. So I was planning to have a minute to be ready here.
I'll prepare them as you go.
So how far did my partner get?
Just started. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, we're going to talk about mobility. And what I'd like to do first is go through some of the highlights of the accomplishments that we've had this year, and then we'll get into talking about Horizon topics. So first, under multimodal transportation, you did adopt a comprehensive bicycle action plan. Thank you for that. We awarded a sidewalk snowplow pilot contract, and we do have maps of those pilot areas for you today if you'd like to take a look at that. So service we expect to begin in December.
Yes.
And just in time for the snow season. Dash ridership is up by 38.6% over last year, so we're doing very well there. Those investments are paying off. On 21st Century Mobility Options, we've launched 2 pilots that are underway, and we'll talk a little bit more about the May Mobility Pilot in a little bit when we talk about Horizon issues. But those pilots are putting us on the map and are helping move us forward. So in terms of accomplishing parking highlights, we opened the 300-space Studio Park, or our 300 spaces at Studio Park. And also we have spaces that we will be operating at the 601 Ottawa ramp as well, or a lot as well, when that is up and running in the spring. We've also issued a RFP to find a development partner to add approximately 200 spaces to what we call the Wedge property, which is on the corner of Fulton and Ionia. And that development will be looking at the RFPs, the responses to that RFP later this year and early next year. In terms of transportation network work, we're at 57% good and fair on our Vital Streets plan. So our goal is 70. We're making progress annually and investing annually to get to that 70% good and fair. And in terms of the work that the Mobility Group has done along with the Economic Development Group on the Equitable Economic Development and Mobility Strategic Plan, they've had 20 focus groups that they've conducted and are narrowing in on the plan recommendations. And those recommendations should be coming to Economic Development Project Team soon. And then we'll come on to the City Commission after that. So, for Horizon issues, there's a bike share RFP that, an e-scooter RFP that will be issued in December, and we'll be having implementation of those 2 services, depending on the responses to the RFP, sometime in the summer of 2020. Along with that process of the RFP, we'll also work on rules and regulations as part of the pilot. We talked about the 2 mobility pilots as a highlight. Let me tell you that we've had almost 30,000 rides on the May Mobility pilot on Dash West, and that's only through November 11th, so we expect those rides to continue to grow. And Josh and his team, or Mr. Naramore and his team, are working on potential phase 2 of the pilot along with the company and the partners. In terms of parking expansion, the Equitable Economic Development and Mobility Plan will provide options for us from a strategic standpoint for investments. There'll be aids in the plan, including a calculator that will help us value and judge potential investments. We did issue the WEDGE RFP, and we'll have a recommendation in January, as I mentioned earlier. And we do expect to invest up to 300 spaces as part of a headquarters expansion that we'll be developing over the remainder of the year. In terms of the Equitable Economic Development and Mobility Plan, that's going to provide options for expansion of our parking supply, also provide options for managing our current supply in a even more effective way than we do already. So techniques and other use of data, essentially, to manage the spaces more effectively. And also will recommend a series of operating changes that could affect staffing and could affect how we deliver those services. In terms of Vital Streets implementation, we're going to continue that work. We will invest money again, $22 million again in fiscal 21, and that includes $5.1 million in debt retirement. So when we had our financial presentation today, we talked a little bit about the debt that has been incurred for Vital Streets. This year will be the last major year for debt payment. This coming fiscal year will be the last major year, and after that, we can accelerate investment in streets and produce even more outcomes. So in terms of mobility options and reduced transportation costs in neighborhoods of focus, the department will work with partners on pilots, and the intent would be to connect people to jobs and make additional transportation options available in neighborhoods of focus and throughout the community. So part of that is working with the Rapid to implement the wave card technology and other partnerships to reduce transportation costs for residents. One of those options might be fleet share or car share, and have been working with various mobility partners trying to find a way to implement car share and actually implement it in a space where it will help with mobility options. Integrated mobility services, we're again working with ITP, the Rapid, on the wave card option and other combined pay options. And as the Rapid works on implementation of the Align study and also their comprehensive operational assessment, that could give us some options for further partnering. And we have appreciated partnering with them on the Dash system and also Route 19 and the Silver Line. And the traffic signal system will see additional investment, requests for additional investment. It's about 60% of our signals are more than 10 years old. We also want to work on connectivity and advancing the ability to do intelligent transportation management of the systems. And so, and also we have to prepare for changes in regional funding because a certain type of funding, which is called CMAQ, or congestion mitigation or quality funding, is being reduced in our region, and that's where we paid for signal improvements from, so intersections improvements. So we need to adjust to that new reality, and so you'll see some things coming in the budget regarding that probably. And then the last one on the list is transit-oriented development in BRT corridors. And so we have the Silver Line corridor that's established, and then the new Lakewood Line corridor that will begin service late in 2020. And those two corridors present opportunities for transit-oriented development, which is more dense in certain nodes around stations, and could help make those systems more effective, and could help with transportation costs and housing costs. It's a multi-faceted way to make improvements in our community. So there's a study going on, again, in addition to the South Division Corridor Plan. There's additional work being done by the RAPID having to do with planning for transit-oriented development in that corridor. And that's a corridor-wide view that goes all the way, includes the entire corridor all the way into Kentwood. So using those tools, that could be horizon issues there as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeLong and Mr. Naramore. Before we have questions, I'd like if you, Mr. Naramore, can elaborate on the issue on the last bullet point on the traffic signal system. And I think we very politely said the need for update and integration, but at least my observation during the last weather event issues, whether winter or the rainstorms, whenever I've asked for a situational update on traffic signal operations, how many are dark, how many are flashing, it appears that much of our intelligence has to come either from complaint-based or windshield drive-bys, because we don't have a SCADA in our traffic operations system that can intelligently monitor all the signals real time. And so that's very manual. And so for us to be our best at preparedness and be proactive and not wait until complaints are made, there's an opportunity to improve our technology and our signal system. You want to talk a little bit about that?
So the city currently manages 212 traffic signals in the city right now, and we have been slowly whittling down that list to offer the communications that's necessary to be able to do that. At the current rate of investment, though, it's going to take us quite a long time, and so you are correct that during some of those, when there is a power outage, there is sort of an inexact science in terms of how we know where the outages are, because if they're without power, then they are treating them all like a four-way stop. But that's actually something that we're probably within the next month or so about. We already have an inventory for our asset management strategy of all the signals, but we've been prioritizing the investments to be able to include a budget ask for the communications and basically starting at the state of, because if we're talking about an automated future, we have to have the basics correct before we look towards doing other types of investment.
And I just say that, and I know there's signals in street lights, but as we talk about priority in terms of conversion of street lights to LED, which is very important, I think as important or more important is where we don't have the ability to assess whether or not traffic signals operable at major intersections, I think is very critical.
And I will say, all of our major corridors are covered. These are more in the minor arterials and the lower classifications of streets where we have that, but the major streets have been, that's where we've prioritized the investment, so the higher carrying of transportation on the system.
Thanks. Can I just ask a follow-up question? Is our traffic signal system on our primary circuit?
Yes.
The entirety of it?
The majority of it is, and we're trying to get all of it on there. There are certain intersections based on where it is throughout the city that are on consumers.
So as we've invested in the primary circuit, could we not do this investment at the same time? Are those different systems completely?
They're different systems. The primary circuit's about delivering electricity, and what Josh is talking about is the communications with the signal to understand how it's functioning, what it's doing.
SCADA system.
It's the fiber optic.
Yes. Think of the SCADA system we have for water, for example. We want to be able to do remote sensing and know what's happening with every signal eventually.
Okay, thanks. Questions? Commissioner O'Connor?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. First, I was talking about updating the system, the street lighting pilot stuff that you're doing is great. It's clearly noticed because we got lots of phone calls from people that, but it's great that it's been a good opportunity to talk about that as well, and the ability to bring the light levels down and adjust them, and it's actually, once you guys have handled it, there's been no follow-up, so it's been really good. Just a couple of things on the horizon topics, I guess, for me, is continue to talk about dash expansion. Especially on the west side, we lost Route 19, and there's no dash north of Bridge Street, and then with 19 going down, you lost if Seward is the primary connector along the west side, so I'll keep advocating for that. One thing I was going to bring up before was the We're continuing working with the Rapid. I've had some conversations with some neighborhood folks down in Garfield Park, as well as our fire department, just about bus stop cleanliness and some issues around. We talked about the homeless issue in our last conversation, and just how we continue to be a partner, especially as we expand the number of bus shelters that exist in our community, and how we manage those for making it a dignified ridership experience for all that choose to do so. So having a plan for keeping them clean, a plan for making sure the trash is picked up, it's one thing to build the infrastructure, but it's the second thing to then take care of that infrastructure, just like we do all our other things. One thing I've talked to the city manager briefly about is just underpass, overpass cleaning, like how we figure out how we do that. I know that that might take some conversations with MDOT, but the idea that we've invested significantly in improving lighting and safety, the feel of traveling under those, but how we how we maintain those better, and like making an investment, if that has to be a private partnership, if we have to expand our alley cleaning program to like get those folks to put that on a rotation, even though it's not necessarily our responsibility. I think it just kind of improves to that welcoming nature of our neighborhoods. And then just finally, the thing I think everyone asks about all the time is that plan for how you put crosswalks in, because everybody calls and asks for them. So.
All good things. And just to let you know, the Rapid is also having conversations about cleanliness.
I know, and I just wanted that to be, something that we've heard a bunch about in the last month, and just want to make sure that it's out there, that we're paying attention to it.
Yeah. Do you, Commissioner Kelly, and then Commissioner Lemay?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the presentation. A couple of things that you've already mentioned, the Dash expansion. We're always interested in that. I too have been hearing about bus stops. When we bring out the e-scooters, hopefully we can get some education around that for safety, because
I'll go on your first ride with you, Ruth.
okay, all right. Hey, I've had 2 motorcycles. I can handle that.
I know you got a bike helmet, so you'll be safe.
I do. And also just, I don't know, on the horizon, perhaps parking enforcement, odd even. I know we've talked about that before. But you've got a very long list here. I know that your department has been taking on more and more and more, Josh. I know we talk about that around our mobility commission table, too. So just to make sure that we have those resources and that we match up the work with the resource that you need to get this work done. So appreciate all you do. I know it's been a heavy lift. I feel like it's so good to see some of these parking spots coming online. I know we're transitioning. We're in a really difficult time now around transit period. I'm excited about the Laker line coming. And that's about it. I'm just concerned about the resources, given the amount of expansion that you've had, and that we don't stress out your department too much.
Yeah, and then Commissioner Lemay.
I just wanted to thank you for pointing out the parking enforcement conversation, and we have been in conversation with the police department, the chief and Mobile GR about looking at that program, because that relates to the other conversation we had on deployment earlier, and that is one of the areas. While we are here, it's not on the list, but the whole downtown event crossing guard, it's a traffic safety issue. In terms of, just to state for the record, I think my purpose in looking at opportunities to redeploy officers are to do so in a sense where we get a real return on staffing. So if we look for areas where we can relieve officers performing I won't say non-essential, but lower priority issues, so that they can focus on the high priorities. And so the parking citation, I think, is a real opportunity to make that impact. In looking at the event crossing operation, I don't think we get any redeployment resources out of that. We get no direct fiscal savings from that, because it's not directly paid from by the city. And just quite frankly, I think for large events, we should really talk about safety for large events, and whether or not that helps or makes it a less safe place. And so certainly willing to continue to look at that, but I think the real opportunity to civilians to assist is on the parking enforcement on odd, even, and we will continue to evaluate that as the chief brings forth his deployment recommendations.
Thank you, that's a good point. I mean, I think to know whether there's cost savings or not, and as we grow and we have more and more events downtown, just the mere presence of somebody in uniform does send a message, so it's important to think about.
I want to clarify, though, I think the mobile GR department pays a significant portion of the police cost, and that's all overtime, isn't that right? And that's gone up year over year?
It is. Yes,
Pretty exponentially?
For Art Prize and for other special events throughout the year, it's split. It's a funding mechanism that splits between the Convention and Arena Authority, our department, and then a smaller portion goes to the Downtown Development Authority. Those three entities split the 100% of the
And sometimes
costs.
events have to pay for it as well?
Yes.
Which can be quite costly.
Well, let me just clarify, but that has no impact to general fund savings?
That's correct.
Right.
That's correct.
Commissioner Leonard?
So if I could just jump into that before I ask the question that I have, I think the other piece that we talked about as officers are directing traffic across the street, their presence during events is welcomed and wanted and appreciated, but just helping people to cross the street, it does include overtime, and so we've heard about officer fatigue, and I think, so it may not necessarily be monetary towards the general fund, but we also want to be mindful of when we are deploying them so that the work that they are doing is work that is on that higher level that you just described, City Manager. But I have a question about the bus shelter expansion.
Okay.
So it had been a priority for many years, and we had allocated resources to it. I know there had been a delay because of the change in leadership at the Rapid. Potentially our change in leadership may have been tied to some of the delay, but I'm just curious to know the status of that since it isn't, listed as one of the priorities here.
So we've made good progress, and Josh will explain what we've done.
So 4 shelters have been installed, 22 will be done before Thanksgiving, and then we will take a pause for the deeper winter months, and then we will complete, our target for the fiscal year is 40 locations, 50 locations to be improved and 40 shelters. All of those will be completed by June 30th. Okay. So it's a learning lesson for us as not having done this, we're not a transit operator. We got the contract on board, we're ready to go, and then to previous comments, we're also working with the Rapid on a memorandum of understanding for the operations of the new ones that are going in, as well as the existing ones. They get to snow maintenance, trash pickup and removal, that we're going to be looking at that as part of the fiscal year 21 budget as well. But that's a collaboration between the two agencies because they have a responsibility because we make up, I believe, it's more than 80% of all the stops in the entire system are within the city of Grand Rapids. And I know that we get 311 gets a lot of complaints about those locations, and we've been tracking them for the last few years. So we're trying to work on it for those basic things about, but they are installed, and we'll have some photos to share with you, the solar lighting and everything. And the narrow profile shelter has actually been really a game changer. And it's educated the Rapid now to be able to install that in other locations, not just in the city, but across all the other 5 partner communities as well.
Great. So that's good to know. Do we have a list already? I know we talked about different models at some point. We probably even talked about locations, but it's all, slipping my mind at this point.
Yes, ma'am. We went through a whole list of them, I think, and we shared kind of a map, but I can get you the updated list of all the locations that will be improved and where they are and which wards. I believe we actually submitted that as part of, but I'll make sure we can get that information to you.
Okay. If it's in this packet, that I can find it.
No, it's
Okay.
No, it was in one of the previous, but.
Okay. Thank you. That would be good to see that updated list, especially since 22 are done, and I haven't seen
22 will
any.
be done by Thanksgiving.
Will be done by Thanksgiving.
Will be
There
done,
are
okay.
4 locations that have been done currently, and they're actually installing them, so you may see them across the city
Okay.
right now.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
Hey, just real quick, I guess Mr. Naramore, I was going to call you Josh, but I had to correct myself, City Manager. Mr. Naramore, wondering if, I know that there's a more extensive plan that's going to be released around the Equitable Economic Development and Mobility Strategic Plan. but just wondering if you could maybe mention some of the highlights or some of the things that came out of the focus groups, perhaps some of the themes that came out of the focus groups that you held in late September.
So specifically as it relates to more the mobility, a big importance on safety with our Vision Zero program. That's actually something that's shared between police and fire, is just in terms of the safety of people using the transportation system, which gets to the question about pedestrian crossings, where are we putting them and how are we maintaining them. Another one is really just on generally how the department and the city communicates to stakeholders about where investment, many of the questions that you're bringing up, how are we communicating that to community in terms of how we're investing in those resources. That continually keeps coming up about the education and awareness of it. And I think another one is the partnerships in terms of addressing first mile and last mile. So that's accessing of transportation resources.
Yeah.
So it's kind of highlighted in here, but to go a little bit more into detail on that is working with the Rapid in terms of talking about a low-income transit fare program that a number of jurisdictions across the country have implemented, as well as working more directly with employers to be able to offer those resources through the Wave Card and for transportation services. Because we already have a really good system in place comparatively, especially in the state of Michigan and in the Midwest. How do we leverage that better for more people to be able to use those services and target them, and working with social service providers? Those are some of the big three highlights, and we're working on comments on sort of a draft report and prioritizing that and lining that up to other metrics within the city strategic plan. But those are the ones that just come top of mind.
Very good. Thank you, sir.
And Commissioner, I think we're poised to deliver a draft of that report at the December Economic Team Committee. Is that right?
I believe so.
For both. But the other thing, he's exactly what I continue to hear, in addition to the access in terms of the routes themselves, it's just communication about letting the community know what we're planning to do, when we're planning to do it, especially around change management to improve in that area. And then the other, in terms of, in addition to age-friendly, I hear a lot of senior members of our community express concern about the pace in which there's innovation and technology, and the complexity or the lack of ease for them to understand and use it. And so I know at some point we're trying to go to this digital services, particularly on parking meters, but there are a lot of people who appreciate the coins that they're able to drop, and it's easier to use. You don't have all the other technology, and so we're going to have to figure out how to navigate that.
Just want for the record, I've driven with Commissioner Lanier before, and she has rolls of quarters that are stacked in her car, so thank you very much.
Commissioners, any other questions on this topic?
Yeah, just because age-friendly was brought up. Earlier today, I heard somebody say that we're done in 2 years, but it's a 5-year.
The planning, yeah.
Just the planning, okay, because it's a 5-year, the clock has started now, it's a 5-year process, but that's good to know, okay.
Yeah. All right.
Can't be done.
I think we can move on to economic prosperity and affordability.
Okay, so Mr. Klooster will join me.
Thank you, Mr. Nierenberg. Thanks.
Fresh from a groundbreaking, Mr. Klooster. Okay, so similar to mobility, I would like to run through highlights for economic prosperity and affordability. And then we'll answer questions about horizon issues or other questions you might have. So in terms of business services, we implemented a new electronic plan review solution in the Development Center. And I can report that 100% of our building plans and all trade plans are coming in electronically now. So the next step is to convert all of the applications for Planning Commission submittals to electronic plan review as well. But that has helped improve customer service and the ease with which we can review plans. So it's been good work by our Development Center there. Also, we have retained the ombudsperson and are working to orient that person now, and they're getting a really crash course in what it's like to be at the development center, and they're doing good work. In terms of business growth, we've had some highlights this year that are really important. So not only did we open Studio Park, but we also were successful in being part of a collaboration that it attracted Acrisure as a downtown to a headquarters location to the Studio Park project. So that's going to mean 400 jobs downtown, and could be really important for our future as Acrisure gets established and moves on. Also, we've partnered with DGRI and the Grand Rapids Area Chamber of Commerce to commission a retail market study and to have a partnership where we can retain a retail specialist. In business growth, we have partnered with Spectrum Leadership to move their projects forward within our community and within the Medical Mile and Innovation District area. And we've also navigated implementation of medical marijuana and are on our way to implementing recreational marijuana as well. In resident education, employment and wage growth, the 2 college through college studio has served over 1,700 students and is helping them get to and through college. And we've also, in terms of employment and wage growth, continued the permitting process for the river restoration, which eventually will lead to construction projects and then businesses alongside of the river. So we've made really good progress on that during this year. Housing, we've been very busy in the housing area. So we've established our housing practice leader approach, and Mr. Kilpatrick is here with us today. And that will help facilitate the city's housing efforts. And we've also partnered with the Grand Rapids Area Chamber of Commerce, the Fry Foundation, and K-Connect to do a housing needs assessment. And that will be underway soon. We've awarded the contract and we'll have results to help us during this fiscal year. We've navigated the dissolution of the Kent County Land Bank and entering into an agreement with the State Land Bank that will help us maintain land banking services in our community. We've completed implementation of the 12 Housing Now recommendations, and those are in effect and working. And also we've used brownfield TIF and other techniques to support 158 units of affordable housing, and we've approved permits for the construction of over 650 housing units during the year. And in terms of Destination City, a little known fact, perhaps, is that the work that our Special Events Office does has created attendance of over 1 million persons at our events during the year. And so the very active office has created very, very active events. We partnered with Project One Enterprise for that inaugural event, and we'll be working with them on the return of our prize in the next year. And we've collaborated with the Convention Arena Authority to examine the feasibility of a convention center hotel and also potential amphitheater. So, fine. Yes. So moving on then to Horizon issues. So we've talked a little bit about the Equitable Economic Development and Mobility Plan as well. And Mr. Klooster has been the project manager for that. And we will have it at if everything goes according to plan, we'll have it at the Economic Development Project team probably in January. So maybe December, probably in January. So we'll do our best. Retail recruitment, we have the contract that we talked about earlier approved, and we're beginning to implement that. Headquarters relocations, we're having new success with that, and it's a focused effort of the city, downtown Grand Rapids Incorporated, the DDA, Right Place, and others. In terms of housing supply, again, we have the housing practice leader on board and housing needs analysis to help point the way. And over the next remaining portion of this fiscal year, we'll have policies to implement, and we'll be working on the Affordable Housing Fund, and we'll be able to operationalize that over this next period of time. In terms of medical and recreational marijuana businesses, we have our licensing ordinance in place, and we will begin reviewing options for how we implement that over the next several months. The zoning ordinance is scheduled to be reviewed by the Planning Commission in January, and so we're on track to begin licensing operations in April of 2020. Equitable investment in neighborhoods of focus and the Third Ward Equity Fund. So we continue to implement aspects of the Third Ward Equity Fund, and we're doing the policy review and investment according to adopted plans. And what I mean by that is there's a question asked earlier about how we're implementing equity in this year's budget. And one way we're doing it is taking all the plans, all the area-specific plans that have been adopted, and having them be reviewed thoroughly by capital planners as they're doing investments to see, okay, if we did this, that might help this happen. So we're trying to be intentional, even more intentional about this year than we have been in the past. So in terms of affordable housing in the land bank, we continue to work with LIHTC developers and providers and to leverage current investments. Mr. Klooster and the Brownfield Authority have found a way to get brownfield money into scattered site housing and also into LIHTC projects, which is a remarkable innovation. And we'll also utilize the state land bank to prepare properties for redevelopment by not-for-profit developers and others. In the corridor improvement authorities, we want to work to focus capital investment in the areas of corridor improvement authorities, and we will also work to focus incentives in those areas, and that's part of the strategy one strategy that may come out of the Equitable Economic Development and Mobility Plan. We're working on the Consolidated Housing and Community Development Plan, and we're doing that in conjunction with Kent County, and that will feed into also will connect with the housing needs assessment work. One of the things we seek to do is to expand the micro-local business enterprise program, and so far this year, the Office of Equity and Engagement has increased MLB registration by almost 50%. So we're up to 40 registered MLBE companies now, and that's good progress on that front. And then river restoration, as I mentioned earlier, will continue in the permitting phase this year, and we've made significant progress here in the last several months, and we're on a good path. So those are the horizon issues, and horizon topics, I should say, for the economic prosperity and affordability, and happy to take questions at this time.
Connor.
Thank you, Mayor. First item would be I really appreciate the commitment of Spectrum to stay in our community and make that investment and keep those jobs and bring more jobs to Grand Rapids. I guess one, not necessarily a concern, but one just like item to focus on is they have a lot of existing facilities in our community that are now going to be vacated because of that decision. And I guess it sort of relates back to the conversation with the mobility discussion about, there's a ton of big, beautiful office buildings on Seward that are going to be vacant now. And so just how we think proactively about, helping recruit, attract, there's been a significant amount of momentum along that corridor and other corridors that are related to Spectrum, and with their consolidation, there's going to be this kind of a vacuum, and how we make sure that we're, providing the resources necessary to, make those viable future redevelopment sites or future reuse sites. I guess as it relates to some of that stuff then along Seward, it's just this also sort of relates to mobility, but it's kind of an economic development thing, is the dash lots on the west side and how we progress with, what's the next phase of that. As we've seen the, studio parks off our back now, and it's been a success to this point, but that's the next real opportunity, and how we start to activate that discussion to make that a reality. Super excited about MLB program. One thing we've talked about in the past, and Commissioner Lanier and I worked together on this in our time on the school board, is just looking to expand to state local purchasing policy. That gives a potential bid discount for local businesses regardless of their, as long as they're located in Grand Rapids, paying Grand Rapids property and income taxes. Is how we look to partner with just businesses in Grand Rapids in general. And then the last thing is, maybe this is the time to bring this up or not. Commissioner Repart brought up the CDBG HUD funds. I just want to put a place marker in there. $1.3 million subsidizes code enforcement every year. And we talked about that last year of the budget. And before it slips away and we have no opportunity to change it, if we're going to talk about creating positive outcomes, like we're supplementing bad actors with limited resource funds that could be used to do other positive outcome things in our community. So just want to make sure that is something that we don't let get slip past us this year.
Yeah, thanks. And Commissioner, let me provide a point of information. At our last DDA meeting, we decided to move forward on a planning process for the redevelopment of Area 7 and 8, so that it'll be very similar to the process that the DDA undertook when it did the South Arena plan. So it'll go through a lengthy planning process, and then the intent is to have those sites redeveloped.
And I guess I'm question about that is stuff south of Arena was a different monster than those were. That was pre-GR Forward. That was pre-City Commission already took action modifying zoning and doing other things. So I just want to, don't need to go through another plan if we've already done 3 plans about these things. Like, how do we get them to market rather than wait for another engagement? I mean, not that engagement's bad, but just that we had a very intensive process around GR Forward and around this commission, our previous commission, about modifying the land use protocols for those areas. So, I hope it doesn't take as long as.
I doubt it will, but it will include some of the partners like the Y and Grand Valley. Commissioner Kelly?
Yeah, so with slide 56, I'm hoping that we can review or go back and look at the Chamber's ease of doing business information. And now that we will be hiring somebody that we work with the Chamber on to do retail market study and retain a specialist, do some sort of either meeting with these local businesses or surveying them to see how we can, maybe working with the development department, review processes to take out redundancies and see how we can streamline. We get feedback about that, about things that got left out and then you've got to go back for another special land use and so on. And then on slide 58, curious about the 158 units and the 652, over what period of time that was, if you could just get back to us with that.
Sure.
And then welcome Ryan. Excited. My understanding is we thought we would maybe get results from that assessment in December, but it sounds like it's going to be later than that. Okay. And in doing the work, I won't be around, so I might not be able to leave Commissioner-elect after all. Saucy, but explore, we've heard this a lot from the community, but in terms of providing for permanency in the city, to explore land trusts and shared equity options, just because we will know that there will always be a need for permanent affordable housing. And then slide 60, a couple things. Hopefully we can work with our partners in housing to look at both lead and energy conservation at the same time, particularly in our neighborhoods of focus in 49507, so that we're, I don't want to say killing birds, but killing.
Addressing multiple issues at once.
Exactly. I don't like
energy efficiency and lead.
Exactly, because as long if we're in the house, we might as well be doing both and really look at that. And that's another, consideration for CDBG funds. Love that we're reviewing capital projects in these neighborhoods of focus in the Third Ward Equity Fund or Third Ward Equity Fund work. For not forgetting that our priority is scattered site and mixed income in the housing arena, and then also exploring community benefit agreements and apprenticeships with folks on the other side of the state, the operating engineers. I've taken two trips there, one with Commissioner Jones and Mayor Bliss, and another one with Doug Matthews, And I know that he assured me that's going to take some time, but it's worth looking at because if we can get people over to the other side of the state to get trained, who live in the city of Grand Rapids, and we'll come away with good paying jobs. That's to Commissioner O'Connor's point, that'll bring in income tax.
Yeah. And Commissioners, just as an FYI, both ICCF and Dwelling Place are moving forward with community land trust projects.
That's right.
Yep,
So I
that's
think
right.
that's
That's right.
important to know. I think it's important for our community.
Yeah.
Commissioner Park?
Yeah, I just want to say a couple of things. I affirm all of these Horizon topics, and I'm excited to dash lots. There's a lot of stuff that I'm excited about that's coming down the pipe. I just want to make sure to mention that I'm hoping that we can restart the conversation around the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and make sure that we get those rules in place so that we can start using that money to make an impact, as well as finding additional sources of revenue for that so that it can go on past that initial 5-year commitment. And I did want to talk about the equitable investments. I appreciate the word that Commissioner Lanier used earlier about expanding that. So I affirm the advocacy that she's made so far around the Third Ward getting more investment, and yet looking for ways that the places in the First Ward that have been also historically had experienced disinvestment can maybe access some additional resources. So I look forward to that conversation when it comes time to see how we can get that right.
Thank you, Commissioner. All right, other comments? Commissioner Lanier and then Commissioner Jones?
I just have a comment about the A2P discussion that I've been trying to have. I think the last time we had a discussion and I brought it up, City Manager, I think you asked the question, why haven't we, city staff, brought anything to the table regarding that? So I'm just still curious to know economically, what we're doing to try and address some of those areas that are being vacated, similar to what you're describing, that potentially will happen with Spectrum's consolidation. So we know that has happened in on a lot of these major busy streets like 28th Street and Plainfield. And so I'm just curious to know, are we taking a look at that and, trying to attract development in those areas? So just want to mention that again.
Well, I just want to say that's really timely. I was just reading about Wyoming and the old celebration, and that they're adding, 300 housing units to that site.
Yeah. And there's some retail.
I thought of you when I was reading it.
Yep.
Yeah, so to answer your question, we have talked about that as opportunity sites for potential development. We have no plan at this point. I think that's a big opportunity as we do the needs assessment. And I also want to respond to the community fund issue as well. And I'm looking forward to that discussion when we, with right now with only $1 million, we have to, as we decide what kind of housing affordability we want at what levels, but also whether or not that's best invested in permanent housing or short-term assistance for those that are unhoused and doing rental assistance. And I'm looking forward to that outcome as well.
Commissioner? Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Jones, and then Commissioner.
One other thing, I know we've talked about this in the past, it sort of relates to mobility and economic development again, is looking at some of our TOD districts and maybe and looking at we always called it a zone-free zone, but I think it really needs to be just a form-based zone. That's a true, we have form-based zoning, don't get me wrong, but I like a much less restrictive form-based district just to let some innovation happen, to really just say, to strip away a lot of the rules about use and just leave it as a form and see what happens. And I think some of those opportunity sites along South Division, along, there's a number of places that it could be potentially tried, but I'd like to really consider that. I know we've seen that again, as we talk about best practices and we look to other communities, Los Angeles, there's been a couple other places that have really done that. They've kind of taken the gloves off. If you're within X number of blocks of a TOD, you can really pretty much do what you want, and it's spurred some housing development in those corridors. So
Yeah, thanks. Commissioner Jones?
Yep, just happy again to hear about the brownfield and the scattered site housing. I just want to encourage you, Mr. Klooster, to continue to operate with a strategic lens around economic development or business development, in particular equitable economic development. I think that everything from the retail recruitment efforts and the number of first floors that are available and vacant, and looking to get creative and trying to recruit a more inclusive group of entrepreneurs. I think that we should be unapologetic and we should be aggressive in our efforts in trying to do all that we can to really go against the narrative that I think is associated with our city from time to time in terms of it being a place in which inclusion is, or that we're devoid of inclusion, especially as it pertains to economic prosperity. And so I just want to encourage you to just do all that you can with the resources that you have to take a look at what's happening around the country, to see what cities are getting it right, and let's not be afraid to partner up with local organizations and institutions that have a desire to want to operate in a more innovative way to create this ecosystem in Grand Rapids that could very well be a model. I'm again, really, really high on the potential of what we could do around inclusive economic development. I think we have all the necessary ingredients. We just have to continue to be aggressive and unapologetic. So.
Yeah. And I'm going to add on to that and echo what a couple of you said. I'm really glad to see the expansion of the MLBE program. I think many of us have questioned why that number wasn't larger in the past. I'm happy to see that it's been doubled, but I still think that there's more that we can do. I'd like to see that number continue to expand. And then I have long said that I support Commissioner O'Connor in us creating a local preference policy, and so maybe we can really take that on this year as we look at from small to large purchases. That if Grand Rapids Public School can do it, I don't understand why we can't. So I feel like we've talked about that multiple times. We've always deferred to the bid discount program. You can have both, I believe, and support our local economy even more. So that should be something that we take a fresh look at, in my opinion. So, any other final comments on this? All right. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, we'll go on to our next section, health and environment. We will go on to our next section, health and environment, Mr. Matthews.
Sorry, we were talking bid discounts.
Did you say to some unhealthy things?
Speaking of health, I think my colleague over here wants some chocolate.
Yeah. Let me also do a time check, commissioners. We were delayed a little bit because of the opening. We're almost through. How much longer after 4:30 can you hang in there? 4:45? 4:45? Okay. We'll hit
And
the
the answer to
accelerator.
that, we'll work through you've got the achievements in front of you, so we'll try and work through that fairly quickly and get straight to the priorities. So health and environment has been a unique one for us because not only does it touch so many of the internal groups, but we're largely dependent on external groups to be able to achieve some of the outcomes, and that's one of the things that we've been working on this year. From a sustainability front, of course, carbon emissions and climate resiliency. Ms. Sutter has been helping us take on those challenges, and we've got a lot of positive things, I feel like, in the pipeline when it comes to those, including an MOU that we're working to finalize with Consumers Energy, which will hopefully pave the way for solar at Butterworth. And that's a pretty important agreement because it's also going to allow us to put that power back onto our own circuit. So we've done a lot of good work in that respect. We also transitioned what had been a task force into a community-wide partnership on climate change, the community collaboration, on climate change, to talk with, community-wide, what is it that we can do to prepare ourselves for the future. When we talk about green spaces, we continue to acquire property for green space and continue to make improvements, in large part thanks to the bond program that was just reapproved by the voters and extended, which I think is a vote of confidence in the direction that we're taking in terms of green space improvement and acquisition. Water resources, we continue to replace lead service lines. We continue to keep an eye on the PFAS issue, although it hasn't presented itself here in Grand Rapids. We're making sure that we're continuing to do that monitoring and testing. The biodigester, of course, continues. The work continues, and the anticipation is that that will be brought online next year. And it's worth noting that the Environmental Services Department was the first in the nation to gain green infrastructure portfolio standards, to adopt those standards for the city. Waste generation and diversion is something that we've got to continue to work on. We've got an RFP ready to go out here pretty soon to take a look at our long-term strategies when it comes to waste management and diversion strategies. And then health disparities is one that we've got to be aligned closely with our county health partners to achieve outcomes. Locally, we continue our focus on lead remediation. We launched a lead awareness campaign just this year, and we continue to talk and work with Kent County on how we can leverage our respective resources to make a positive impact. Then we launched a partnership last year with GVSU and Seamless to start more actively monitoring air quality and collecting that data in some targeted areas. And I know that Ms. Glover and her team are working to get that raw data so that we can start doing some analytics and see where the intersections are between where we have concerns about air quality and what are some of the things that we can do to affect it, whether that's through the tree canopy, whether that's through one of the other things we've talked about recently, which is the routing of trucks and transit through the community. So we feel like from a data standpoint, that's going to help us achieve some of our longer-term health outcomes as well. When we look at our horizon topics, we're continuing with the rollout of the LED street lighting, which has impacts not just on probably less on power consumption than it does on the opportunities that it presents for some of these other technologies. Lead abatement and remediation will continue to be a priority for us, as well as carbon reduction. Really zeroing in on a renewable energy strategy for the city and for the community, as well as waste diversion. That continues to be a big conversation, not for us, but with all of our partner cities in the region. Completing the biodigester project, which I mentioned. Continue our water quality improvements. And using that, your budget allocations, but also the bond approval. Sorry, we're getting late in the day. The new parks millage to really expand recreational opportunities and access, both at a regional level, but also at the neighborhood level. The last thing that we've got here is really placing a focus on potential collaborations to reduce opioid abuse and to contribute towards recovery in our community.
All right. Well, I'll start with just a couple questions and comments and then turn to my colleagues. So the first one, can I get a reminder about how many years it's going to take us for full lead service line replacement? I see we've already spent $1 million this past year and replaced 129 lines, but can I get is that a 10 or a 20-year project?
Got the man with the answers, right?
And that's the lead remediation all the way to the home?
It's 5% a year is what our goal is.
Can you, yeah, I was just trying to remember. I know what the lead and copper rules are, but I can't remember our plan.
So we have to file a plan. It's kinda high. We have to file a plan with Eagle regarding our lead remediation. And we're in the process of developing that plan. And we have been advanced in lead service remediation. We've been ahead of any community in the state of Michigan. And it'll be probably a 25-year or longer plan. So we have to work with our within our asset management plan, and we will work with with Eagle to get the correct plan in place. The replacements are required by the new lead and copper rule, but know that our water is in great shape, because of the way we treat our water, and we consistently make our testing requirements, and we do very well with that.
Okay, great, thanks for that information. Then, Commissioners, just one thing, and many of you probably are aware of this already, but in response to the recreational opportunities and access conversation I've had with a number of folks in the community, and I'm hopeful to see move forward, is to make sure that every child who goes to Grand Rapids Public Schools, they have an opportunity to learn how to swim by the time they're in third grade, to hopefully address the number of kids who drown each year. So hopefully with our continued focus on recreation and health, that will be something that we'll be able to do in partnership with GRPS in the years moving forward. And I know Lynn's in the room. She's been a part of some of those conversations, but that's been a long time goal for many people. So just appreciate seeing that on there. Commissioner Rippert?
So just I'm real excited to see the Butterworth Solar and the LED rollout. Three things that I just wanted to highlight. When it comes to lead, I feel like, well, first of all, our task force meets in 2 weeks, and we're going to have some recommendations. We've got this great tactic report, and so hopefully there's going to be some resources to be able to implement what they come up with. But consistently, it's been kind of brought up that there really needs to be a point of contact for the staff to push the issue forward. So that's a staffing consideration. The same is true, I think, for sustainability. There's all these great goals for energy, and Allison is helping us with all these beautiful metrics, and so I know that we backfilled her position, but I do think that if we're going to make progress, there's got to be someone driving the boat and making all the contacts. I think that there's a lot of things that could happen if we had the staff power to do it. So I just wanted to, those are two staffing considerations in this thing that I'm interested in talking about. And then really we passed this Parks millage, so excited about it. We passed it without our administrative guidelines, so I heard that mentioned earlier that within a month or so we'll get those, but I think particularly for the voters who are, making sure that the money from the general operating fund is matched with that, to just button that up as soon as possible is I think important for us to do.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sure Commissioner Kelly wants to do that while she's still around the table.
That's right.
Commissioner Kelly?
So because we had only just passed our strategic plan around the time that we talked about backyard fires, I kind of held my tongue, but I do want to say that in spite of the Asthma Society, the American Lung Association, and the Kent County Health Department, we went forward with expanding that, and what I don't know, but I do, is how much that's affecting air quality. And I don't know whether we can measure that in any way, but I do recall that the first time we passed it, that we had just received a report on our air quality. We were right at the threshold of being out of compliance. So it's just something to look at. We're talking about health and the environment and carbon, and then we went ahead and added to it. So, and the other thing is a couple of things. The National Green Infrastructure Certification Program, I think that's something worth pursuing as we're doing more green infrastructure, not just gray infrastructure. We're going to have to figure out how to maintain it. It's a great opportunity for workforce development as well. And then finally, around carbon sequestration and trees and all the benefits that we get, I'm real pleased, and I continue, just last week at our Urban Forestry Committee, as this commission liaison, and really pleased with the results that we're getting from being more proactive rather than reactive. It's difficult sometimes to explain that to our constituents, but I've worked with 311 and Becky Jo. You've been great about gathering some data, and that's what it takes. It convinces residents that it's worth the wait because we're saving tax dollars if we do this more proactively, and there's been some opportunity for us to learn from other communities that have been really proactive in tree pruning, how much money you save because when a storm comes through, and property damage, and potentially even damage to people. We had a situation like that, unfortunately, in Riverside Park that encouraged us to add resources to catch up, and we're not there yet with our aging out maples, for example. And I'd like to see us work at the legislative level to encourage our Public Services Commission at the state level to also adopt best practice, which means tree trimming on the part of our power companies every 4 to 5 years instead of every 7 to 12 years, for 2 reasons. One, as we are planting trying to increase our urban forest canopy, when they come in and cut so far back because they haven't done it frequently enough, it damages these trees, and they can potentially die, but they certainly have to spend a lot of energy just healing again. And in the end, it saves consumers energy money, just like it would us, because we'll have, even though it seems counterintuitive perhaps because they have to go out more frequently, it actually saves them money, and it saves our citizens from having power outages. So I think that if we can look at that, if Karen can help us with that over time. I know that the committee itself has talked with Consumers Energy about doing a pilot here in the city. I just wanted to make you all aware of it, and hopefully you'll keep that on your radar.
Thanks, Commissioner. And if we do have data related to air quality, the last study I read, I believe there was a strong correlation with poor air quality around industrial spaces and the lack of green space and trees. So if we have updated data on that and where those hot spots are, that would be really helpful. All right, any final questions, Commissioner Lanier?
Yes, so I am pleased to see that the lead abatement and remediation is here on the horizon topics. I know that we have a meeting coming up next week. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And, but I also want to make sure that as we're considering what comes from this group, that we're also looking at what came through the state's task force as well as the county's task force, so that we can kind of look comprehensively, because there may be things that, from those recommendations that may not show up in this, in the body that's working on it currently. So I just want to make sure that those don't get missed, because there are some really good recommendations that I think could be applied to the city. Then the other point that I want to make is actually a question surrounding the health and wellness position here at the city, and I know it was reported on earlier, kind of with the financial reporting, but I'm curious to know, and maybe this could speak to Commissioner Rephart's suggestion about making sure there's a staff person with oversight over what's happening with lead. So I'm just curious to know if we have the plan yet, and if that position would be only internally focused, or do you see it potentially being externally focused too? Because it also could impact the point that you were making about swimming and some other things, you know, health and wellness related across the city. So I'm just curious if we've gotten that far.
That's a good question.
The intent of the position was to focus on employee wellness. It was an employee wellness program, healthcare. We have just made an offer to a person, and they're excited to come to do that. I think we would have to reevaluate capacity as they start, but the focus is where we have the largest internal cost is on the health program. I think regarding consumer or public awareness and education, we need to look at that, because I know we've talked about some other things related to ordinances and inspections, and that position might potentially be the one to help with that and other education. I know that Ms. Bohach has indicated that they are resource constrained around that, so that's something we need to look at.
Thank you.
All right, any final questions before we move on to the last section? All right,
I got one
Commissioner Moody?
question, and the health awareness for the employees, is mental illness a part of that?
I think it's comprehensive wellness, both physical as well as mental, and I think for the employee, we're going to defer to the professionals, the employee assistance program, but there's another component within the police department that assists with officer wellness, and there's an internal resource to support officers for mental health and traumatic issues.
Okay, so we'll move on to engaged and connected. When we talk about enhancing communication, this was a big year just in terms of getting organized and really professionalizing our program. We initiated a number of high-profile initiatives this year, including the River Restoration Project, work on the census, the lead awareness campaign, human trafficking, and started to establish the policies that are necessary for the organization to really coalesce around this idea of one city and one voice. Socrata, of course, from a transparency standpoint, was a big piece of making what it is that we do more open to the public. From a community engagement standpoint, we brought on the census coordinator and our ambassadors, and have really started ramping up that campaign. I got an update from Mr. Canfield over the weekend, just outlining the additional partnerships and the outreach that individual has done. I think it's pretty impressive on the timeline that she's been on. We produced a number of new special events in neighborhoods of focus, and initiated a partnership with Urban Core Collective as part of the Zero Cities project. And that's one of the areas where I feel like as we continue to work on a comprehensive engagement strategy, it's really going to be critical that we have our partners involved. The organization is never going to have the resources, the number of people to be able to do it all ourselves, nor should we do it all ourselves. So I'm looking forward to continuing in that vein. Engaging and enhancing community perception. Of course, we launched the community survey. We'll have those results here in a few weeks, actually. And but I don't know if you saw, we just pushed out the open segment of that survey. The interest there is that if we open it up as an open digital survey, we want to see what the results are from an open digital survey as opposed to the statistically valid mailed survey, so that we can really test our investment and how we might want to do these things in the future. Elevating resident voice, we completed the first two phases of engagement for MLK Park, Neighborhood Association and the visioning for MLK Park Lodge. Continuing to serve a number of neighborhood associations and individuals through the Leadership Academy. And I know that the clerk has been really focused on making sure that voting is as accessible as it possibly can be based on the data that he gets. So when we look at the Horizon topics, one, and this came up here recently, is improving language access. Some of you may not be aware, we had interpreters available at the last meeting, and we did live interpretation so that we've got a video feed in Spanish of the evening proceedings the same way that we do the morning proceedings. The next meeting, we're going to continue to refine that process so that folks have a better idea that it's available. We'll make an announcement at the beginning of the meeting in Spanish for anybody that wants to use the interpretive equipment, either to listen to the proceedings or if they need somebody there by their side to be able to help articulate their feelings. So we're going to be more intentional about that in the coming year. Developing communications capacity. Yes, sorry.
One question about that. So I really appreciate that, especially how quickly you were able to make that happen, based on feedback from this group. But I'm curious, is there also the ability for us to have an earbud if somebody is speaking in Spanish, where we can have automatic translation for those of us listening? So I'm thinking about like when I have somebody speaking during public comment and they're speaking in another language, can those of us, is there also technology available where we can get automatic translation?
That would be challenging. I mean, I imagine that it could be done, but what we were doing was we were going to have somebody here that can stand next to them and do the
And
interpretation in
interpret,
real time.
okay. Instead of real time.
Right.
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 So the commission's, interpreting for the commission would be based on exception. The technology would allow the entire meeting to be heard in one's
Right,
own
yeah, and
language.
I think that's
Spanish, really.
fantastic, and I'm glad that that's available now. I think that's great. I just know I've been to meetings before where there's a number of speakers who speak in different languages, and I'm able to, have a headphone and listen to an interpreter.
The
Yeah,
answer is
well,
yes.
a lot of
It's-
national conferences have that available.
Yeah, the answer is yes. It's just having a plan for how it is that we deploy that.
Yeah.
And that's what I want staff to focus on this year is working with departments to have language access plans so that we know exactly what we're doing, when we're doing it, and why.
Yeah.
In that way, our partners like the Hispanic Center know what target they're training towards.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, and I can follow up with you on that later.
Communications capacity is a pretty big issue. We've put a lot of demands on not a lot of resources at this point, and they've done an extraordinary job. We are at a point where we've really, if we want to do things the way that we say we want to do them, we've got to have a conversation about resourcing in that space. I can tell you as somebody that spent almost 20 years doing communications, it's uniquely additive. You don't replace a lot of things with other things, you just add more things. I think one of the only things that I ever dropped from my roster was faxes. Outside of that, you just keep adding things to reach people, right? To reach people in the way that's most convenient to them, and it's a conversation that we need to be able to have. Conducting engagement training and expanding channels, including technological channels. We want to, the same way that we want to reach people with our communications in the way that's most convenient for them, we need to offer a suite of engagement opportunities so that folks can engage in the way that's most comfortable for them. The tradition for a government is to have a meeting, have folks stand up and have folks speak, and that works for a segment of the population, but my experience shows that there's a lot of folks who don't feel comfortable in that space, and we've got to be thoughtful about the options that we're providing, and then training to a standard across the entire organization. We have a lot of departments that are asked to go out and engage, and we want to start building expectations specifically about what that's going to look like. It took your feedback to heart. Once we get the community survey results, we want to take a look at that and decide how we might want to follow up in a focused way within the wards if there's some issues that pop up geographically that we want to dig further into. The idea may be that we do a community survey every other year, and in the intervening year we do a more focused look at the ward level based on what those results are. And then developing resident leadership capacity and opportunities on the boards and commissions. That was something that overwhelmingly came out of our top management retreat a couple of weeks ago. When we were prioritizing the measures and the objectives that we felt like we wanted to focus on, that was one that was almost universally brought forward.
All right, thanks. I'll start. In addition to that, can we maybe add on to the last bullet and add, we talked about it actually a couple times, and just recently we talked about it again with the appointments committee, having a quarterly orientation and training for every single person appointed to a board or commission, so that when they get around the table, they're prepared and confident and they know what the expectations are, and particularly if they're on a board where there's legal ramifications, that they're well aware of those. And I know our city clerk knows that that's a priority, but I think in addition to developing resident leadership capacity, we need to make sure that once they get selected to serve, that they feel confident and prepared to do it and do it well.
He embraces that wholeheartedly, and we'll have it done by next week.
Perfect, thanks.
No, I'm just kidding. He's not here to finish up.
Joel, if you're listening, we need to talk.
All right, so commissioners, on this section, feedback. My communications expert over here, Commissioner Jones, anything to add?
Just one quick thing. I can't agree more about the need to continue to, look for resources to make efforts to try to operate at the optimum level with regards to communications. I don't think enough can be said about that. I think that we probably need to have a mindset of actually over-communicating, if we, to the best of our ability, to our constituency in the city. I think we're in a day and age where people expect to have access to information, and so maybe it's not by way of human capital, but maybe we can do more, along the lines of technology. Just whatever we can do to, again, get the word out and to the best of our ability, make sure that we are trying to communicate our narrative to our residents.
Yeah, agreed. Commissioner Moody?
Yeah, I like the improving the language access, but what happened if we have other cultures come in from Africa, from China, Japan, or whatever, or even Russia, that don't speak English? Will there be interpreters for those individuals as well, too? Then, before you answer that, let me say one more thing. I also would like to make sure that we don't have people coming in who can speak English, but also speak in Spanish if it's not necessary.
To the latter, I imagine that there may be some First Amendment concerns just in terms of, folks choose to express themselves the way that they do. In terms of other available languages, I do know that the Hispanic Center does teach interpreting for a number of other languages. One of the things that I was able to do in my previous role was build out a fully functioning language access program before I left. And part of that planning process is identifying through census and refugee services data the communities that are most in need of service, proportionally, percentage-wise, and then working with the departments to identify who are they reaching on the most regular basis. So every department had a language access plan that had a shared component, but then they had a specialized component that was based on who they knew that they were serving, so that we could be prepared and have the contracts to be able to serve them appropriately. In some cases, that might be utilizing a telephone service as opposed to an in-person service, but making it known that it's available and getting in the cadence of receiving those and processing those requests appropriately is a big piece of the puzzle, and we're just starting that.
Yep.
Well, city manager says you can do this stuff in 1 week, so I'm looking forward to
No.
it.
I just want to clarify and add to what Assistant City Manager Matthews said on we don't have an English-only policy for communicating in public venues, and so unfortunately that's the way we've kind of operated. Some of the agenda hasn't been translated, but I think we have to be open to allowing people to communicate in whatever language they feel comfortable.
Would you repeat that, City Manager, when we said we don't have a...
No, we don't have a English-only policy for any public communication. By default, I think that's how we have been operating. We've been sitting materials without translation service, non-translated materials, but we're trying to go the other way to have dual languages or many languages in terms of being able to accommodate the public. And so I'm speaking to the latter. Only requiring people to speak one language is something that would be inconsistent with our values of inclusion.
Correct. Right. Mm-hmm. Commissioner Kelly?
So maybe this will save you some time. Apparently, the state has a language line that supports all languages spoken in the state, so maybe we can just tap right into that.
We actually do use the telephone language line, 311 does.
Oh.
So there are times where that's the most appropriate pathway. But you also want to be very intentional about having that information upfront and available when somebody walks to a desk, and have the employees trained on how to utilize that line. There's a tail end to that too, which is those are all charged by the minute. They're all things that you can overcome, but you want to have a plan going in. Otherwise, you'd have a lot of folks that start getting bills that they didn't expect, or they don't handle it appropriately. It becomes a negative experience for the customer, and then you've kind of worked against your own goal in the first place.
Yeah, good to know. So, I can't tell you how many times I'm out at a board meeting somewhere else, and people will say, well, we'll have the neighborhood associations get the word out about that. And so here we are, we've got these neighborhood connectors, and we're trying to build more neighborhood associations, and we've got the current ones. And I just think they just don't have the capacity. So I think at some point we need to think about that load and how we can do something, whether it is to help them get mailers out, whether they could have space in We Are GR. But this comes up all the time. I'm sure, you recall those conversations. And then finally, I just really want to thank Mark and staff for the follow-through you've been doing at our city commission meetings.
Yes.
Because that's where people come and communicate with us publicly, and of course, it's on Facebook as well. But you have been excellent in making sure that somebody gets some information at those meetings or soon after, and that is just fabulous. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'll add, I'm sure all of us appreciate that. And then getting the updates on the response is really helpful too. Thank you. All right, any other questions or comments, commissioners? All right, and then City Manager, I don't know if you drew everyone's attention to the additional documents you provided, but commissioners, you have a City of Grand Rapids achievements, and these are just in the past year. When you read through the whole thing, it is unbelievably impressive. So I hope you take some time to read that. And then also we received a copy of the metrics. And so if you have any feedback or questions about that, please send them Allison's way, I assume. Does that go to you? If we have feedback on either of these documents?
It is. I think the city manager will have some conversations as well, but just to note, the highlights are recommendations. We talked about narrowing down the 140 metrics. So you have 6 highlighted per priority, and those are recommendations from city manager for those to highlight for that dashboard development. So we'll work to receive some feedback from you to develop that dashboard over the next few months.
All right, wonderful. Anything else, City Manager?
No, thank you again for your engagement, feedback. This is very helpful to me, helpful to staff. We will be following up on the feedback. I want to thank the staff for the work today, everyone who has contributed to making this possible, all the way from the strategic planning team to the cable TV crew. Thank you for setting this up, and I appreciate the feedback.
All right, thank you. All right.